This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And we are back with another episode of Art of Darkness, the podcast about the dark side of creativity. This is a core episode. Going to be very exciting. I'm Kevin Kautzman, joined by the man in Michigan, up in Michigan today, and always. Well, most of the time. Brad Kelly. Brad, how are you? Yeah, most of the time. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, man. How are you doing?
I am excited. And the way this podcast works, of course, is that you and I pass the core episodes back and forth. We each do one a month, which I find is just enough time to feel like you've forgotten how to do it in between each of the core episodes. But once you get in the ring and you're eye to eye with that bull, and the bull is snorting at you, and you got your cape and you're ready for the bull to charge. You flick the cape out of the way. It's maybe 10 minutes in, you flick the cape, and hopefully the bull doesn't get you in the groin. I don't think that's going to happen today. We may have a few may have a few head injuries today. But nothing that could really damage us too much anyway. So it might improve the quality of the pod. But before we get into the subject, I'm already beginning to hint at it. I have to introduce a very special guest who we are thrilled to have with us. Friend of the pod, novelist, Substacker. Some call him the judge of Substack. Aaron Gwyn. Aaron, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, guys.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We've been looking for a reason to have you back on since the last time. So I'm really excited to have you with us today. Thanks, Aaron.
Awesome, man.
Aaron is the rare bird, I feel, who could come with us on practically any episode and hang. Before we get into it, Aaron, tell people a little bit about yourself, what you got going on, where they can find you.
Yeah, so I'm a novelist. I've been doing a Substack devoted to Blood Meridian, and it's just Blood Meridian Substack. And you can get caught up on my latest endeavors at American Gwyn on Twitter, and that's just American GWYN. And if you're interested in my book stuff, if you're interested in my Substack, it's all there.
Dynamite.
Yeah, let me put in a word for your Substack for people who are familiar with Blood Meridian, and even if you're not, but if you've read Blood Meridian, you're like, that book is something else. Read Gwyn's Substack. you're gonna open up an entire world that's inside that book that maybe you didn't even quite realize was there. It's impeccably well done. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's very sweet, man.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, and it's a breakout Substack too. It's achieved popularity very quickly, and it's extremely exciting. We're hoping Aaron will come back and join us at the end of the year for Patreon. We're hoping to do a Blood Meridian special, so we may have to strong arm Aaron to come back on.
I'm in. I'm in.
Right,
I'm all in.
All right.
Oh,
Excellent.
dynamite. Yeah, let's get into it. All right, before any further ado, without further ado, today we're going to a bullfight. It's going to be a boxing match. We're going deep sea fishing. We're going to write drunk and edit sober. And we're going to look at a life that changed the way Americans express themselves. Brad, one thing you say is that writing well is thinking well. Well, what does that mean if there was, imagine if you will, a figure who changed the way that we write in the English language? Did he also change the way we think? I would argue, perhaps. Yeah. We're going to get into it. And we're going to talk about one of the great troubled men of the 20th century. Some call it his century, Papa's century. Ernest Hemingway. Big Air. I am excited.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Ernest Miller Hemingway. Before we get into it, I got to bump Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Check us out. Every episode, we do an After Dark. You get an additional 20 or 30 minutes. This one might even go a little bit longer. You also get access to our Bookends Book Club, which involves, if you care to join us, a private Zoom link. You can join in reading literature that is both contemporary and adjacent to the subjects we covered. And yeah, if you can't attend, we put those recordings up online for Patreon subscribers as well. We also have a Telegram, which is quite active and interesting. And that is at t.me/artofdarkpod. And of course, Brad is at the helm of our Twitter account, twitter.com/artofdarkpod. I will tease the After Dark in a little bit, but first I have to ask the opening question to Brad. And I expect you know a few things about this guy, being an American novelist yourself, Brad. What do you know about Ernest Hemingway?
Yeah, I was going to jokingly say who, but yeah, as you said, as somebody, I think everybody kind of knows the name of Ernest Hemingway. You talk to people in my real life who maybe touch in on the show and check out what we're doing, and a lot of times they don't know who a number of our figures are. Somebody like Maya Deeren, who we did a few weeks back, they're not going to know who that is. But Ernest Hemingway, I don't think I could find somebody who has not heard the name Ernest Hemingway. And as a writer, his presence looms enormous. So, American writer, born, I don't know exact year, but probably right at the end of the 19th century, figures hugely into the movement of literary modernism, all this stuff that came out after World War I. Known for his oddly enough, his revolution in literary style, that has sort of echoed and permeated. I mean, I think any writer who's sort of finding their voice, whether they know it or not, they're in conversation with what Hemingway was up to when it comes to the economy of language, and the whole sort of iceberg theory. You're always kind of, even people who are choosing a style that's more elaborate than Hemingway, they know that they're doing it sort of against Papa's wishes. A little bit, there's a little bit of like, I know Hemingway did this, but I'm going to do something a little different.
I'm leaving that adverb in.
Yeah, what's that?
I'm gonna get a little florid.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So no, huge figure.
Looming, towering, troubling.
Yeah.
Gwyn, do you co-sign? Is that all fair?
All of that I co-sign. Yeah. I mean, Hemingway changed the way that we thought about what an American novelist can be. He obviously changed the prose style in ways that people who deny it still use it to deny it. And he also changed the idea of literary celebrity. There's probably no one before Hemingway except for Twain and to some extent Hawthorne who has the kind of media savvy and people, young men want to be. A lot of guys moved to Paris and tried to become writers because of reading a Hemingway story or just seeing pictures of Hemingway. And so his effect on the imagination of young men in America has never been replicated, I don't believe.
Totally agree. And it's very interesting because you're predicting something that I'm going to start to tease. And actually, it's a nice segue into the After Dark for Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Somebody in our Telegram just now, Sarah Kira Vandenvoid, we love our Telegram, asked, was Hemingway a KGB sleeper agent? And I believe you want to touch on this in the After Dark for Patreon, correct, Aaron?
That's right. I've read the book. I've seen the documents.
Oh, you've got the documents?
I have the documents. Rachel Maddow and I have the documents.
Very good. Well,
Awesome.
And Maddow has what you might call a Hemingway haircut. He would approve
Absolutely
of the
has a Hemingway haircut.
Hemingway, and we're going to get weird with it. There's a lot of interesting stuff. Everybody thinks they know Hemingway. Unless you've really dug into it, you don't know Hemingway. And so by the end of this episode, I hope you will feel like you leave knowing a little bit more about the great man. We're going to try to take the two-dimensional image people have and I guess square the circle. We're going to try to give it 3, 4, 5 dimensions, at least 4 dimensions, for one for each of the wives. And just a little bit of housekeeping here for the three of us. We're probably going to go long. I don't stand on ceremony. If you got to get up, just call it out, go on mute, and do your business. I'll probably have to at some point too, so no stress. So on the After Dark for Patreon, we'll go an additional 20, 30 minutes, probably more on this episode, and we are going to answer the question, was Ernest Hemingway a KGB sleeper agent? We're also going to delve further into Hemingway's time at Mayo Clinic receiving electroshock therapy. We'll cover that a little bit on the main episode. It's very important, but we're going to go a little deeper. Fun fact, some years ago, I wrote a play for a theater in town here called History Theater. A journalist from town here, John Rosengren, picked up the story and went and did some original research, wrote an award-winning piece of journalism, which I'll cite on this episode and probably in the After Dark too, and found some of the last known images of Hemingway. They were going to be published in his piece, but at the last minute, the family who holds the images asked that he would not do it. And I will talk a little more about that. So that to me is really quite precious, frankly, that there's this little tiny bit of the Hemingway myth that maybe I inserted myself into. And John in particular, and John, like you said, Aaron, is precisely that. Read Hemingway at a young age, moved to Paris, and is a working freelance journalist, the real deal. I'll get into a little bit more of that as we go, and then on the After Dark. We are also on the After Dark going to talk about Hemingway's gender-bending sex life and role switching. There was a novel that was only published posthumously, which I believe he wrote in the 40s, called The Garden of Eden, which I think, if you don't know, will surprise you. Okay. All right. Yeah. That's not what you expect from Hemingway, is it? It does not really square with the macho image. And then finally, we're going to hear from the great Hunter S. Thompson about Hemingway and his time in Ketchum, Idaho, which is where he would, and I don't think I'm giving this away, he would finally commit suicide. So Patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. This is not a vibe pod. We put in the effort. We put in the work. Please support the pod. It starts at $5 a month, and your support means the world to us. We love doing this show. We want to do it as long as we can remain cogent, and or until our agents come to pick us up, and we will. We'll get into that too. Before we dig into the bio itself, I have to mention the source material. I can't think of a writer, an American writer, or probably any writer who is more well documented. I have a stack of books here that is just absurd. I'm not even going to try to fiddle with it, including his writing, but then writing about him. I have his last wife, Mary Welsh Hemingway's autobiography. I've got the Lynn biography of Hemingway. I've got a book called Hemingway on War. I've got the Great Hemingway's Boat by Paul Hendrickson.
Fantastic. The best Hemingway book that's been written, in my opinion.
A really wonderful book. And for the spine of the bio, I principally use two sources. I'm going to refer to Wikipedia. The Wikipedia is robust, but I'm not just going to read it, A to Z. There's going to be detours, and our friend Aaron is going to be reading from some of the work as we go along. And I also watched the great Ken Burns PBS documentary. I would say that's a great primer, but it maybe doesn't go into the work as deeply as we will or intend to, because obviously they wouldn't have enough. They didn't have enough time. I mean, you could do a 20-part documentary on Hemingway and really not even get the whole story. So, all right, we ready to rock? Let's do it.
Let's do it. All
right. Ernest Miller Hemingway was born on the 21st of July, 1899 in Oak Park, Illinois, an affluent suburb just west of Chicago, to Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, a physician, and Grace Hall Hemingway, a musician. She was an opera singer, and she wanted to have a career. We're going to get to it. His parents were well-educated and well-respected in Oak Park, a conservative community about which resident Frank Lloyd Wright, future subject no doubt, said, "So many churches for so many good people to go to." Aha. When Clarence and Grace Hemingway married in 1896, they lived with Grace's father, Ernest Miller Hall, after whom they named their first son, the second of their 6 children. His sister Marceline preceded him in 1898, followed by Ursula in 1902. That's a name you don't hear anymore. Ursula. Yeah. Madeline in 1904, Carol in 1911, and Lester in 1915, like the cheese, Lester. Now, Grace, and we're going to get into this, she followed the Victorian convention of not differentiating children's clothing by gender. The past is the future. With only a year separating the two, Ernest and Marceline resembled one another strongly. Grace wanted them to appear as twins. So in Ernest's first 3 years, she kept his hair long and dressed both children in similarly frilly, feminine clothing. All right. So I'm going to pull from the Lynn Hemingway, Kenneth S. Lynn Hemingway biography here about this twinning. I don't think there's a writer who's been more psychoanalyzed than Hemingway. It's almost sort of inevitable that we're going to touch on a little bit of this. Okay, so let's see here. At Walloon Lake, which I believe is up in Michigan, at Walloon Lake, they would spend summers up there. In 1900, and you were spot on, Brad, end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
The summer of Ernest's first birthday, he and Marceline had played naked on the narrow beach in front of their parents' newly completed cottage. Dr. Hemingway's snapshots of them in the buff, duly pasted into scrapbooks by Grace, are charming. But while splashing his feet in the water and exploring the rowboat pulled up on the shore, it can be presumed that Ernest had ample opportunity to notice, if he had not done so already, that he and his sister were not built identically. Did the infant boy take pride in the equipment that set him apart from Marceline? Or did the sight of her smoothness make him think that she had suffered some sort of dreadful accident which might soon befall him as well? Or were pride and fear intermingled in his turbulent imagination? Familiar Freudian speculations, these, which acquire extra force in this case because Ernest would soon become aware that he and Marceline were being treated like twins of the same sex. And in years to come, the horrific image of phallic loss would be made light of by Hemingway in tall tale jokes about such matters as the hazards of skiing in sub-zero temperatures, and dealt with seriously in two anguishing works of fiction, God Rest You Merry Gentlemen, and The Sun Also Rises. His developing relationship with his older sister may have been a source of emotional turmoil in other ways, too. Marceline was a much steadier walker than he was and could easily out-wrestle him. Far more often than not, in authentic boy-girl twinhoods, the girl is larger and stronger than her brother until puberty. In the spurious Marceline-Ernest twinhood, Marceline's genetic advantage was compounded by the fact that she was 18 months older. It was Grace's belief that her twins were the same size, but the photos of them belie that idea. As late as their freshman year in high school, Ernest was a whole head shorter than Marceline. Be careful what you do with your kids.
Well, yeah.
This is a recurring theme on Art of Darkness.
Yeah.
Now, in Oak Park, his father would sometimes perform emergency C-sections, which is a theme that would return in Hemingway's work a number of times, both in the short stories and in the fiction. A Farewell to Arms very famously concludes with, I believe, a C-section and the death of the mother and the child. And then I think there's a story, Indian Camp. We'll come to it. But so Hemingway had kind of a mixed upbringing. He was sort of mixed. There would be tea parties, and there would be air guns. He would say, "Afraid of nothing," right? Not afraid of anything.
Yeah.
Ernest's mother, who we've already seen maybe was a little bit delusional or just kind of oblivious or in her own mind. These kids are the same. Well, okay, they're not the same size. She would always remind the children that she gave up her career as a performer for them. Although apparently she couldn't perform because she had a condition with her vision where she couldn't stand the stage lights. My reading also told me that she made more money than their father as a teacher. She would tutor people in music. And so, there was this tortured dynamic between them, and Hemingway would come to revile his mother. Very famously, he called her an all-time all-American bitch.
Whoa.
We'll get into it. Oh, this is an episode we don't have to go looking for the darkness.
No, we already hit a little bit of it. Yeah.
Yep. So I've already said his childhood was very gender bendy up to a point. His hero was Teddy Roosevelt.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was this weird twinning with his sister. So he had dolls and dresses and air rifles. Fun. Hemingway's mother, who we're not going to escape, was a well-known musician in the village. She taught her son to play the cello, despite him refusing to learn. Later in life, he would admit that the music lessons contributed to his writing style, evidenced in the contrapuntal structure of For Whom the Bell Tolls. People had noted this, the influence of Bach. I think he was listening to an awful lot of that when he was writing that novel, if I'm not mistaken. As an adult, Hemingway professed to hate his mother, although biographer Michael S. Reynolds points out that he shared similar energies and enthusiasms. Each summer, the family traveled to Windermere on Walloon Lake near Petoskey, Michigan. Where is that, Brad?
Petoskey, Michigan is right where I got married.
Oh, right.
Up at almost the tip of the pinky. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I was there, and it was a lovely ceremony. Yes. I don't think there was a fraction of the psychodrama happening there that Hemingway
Probably
that Hemingway had at any of his weddings.
Yeah.
Well, there near Petoskey, young Ernest joined his father and learned to hunt, fish, and camp in the woods and lakes of northern Michigan. These experiences instilled a lifelong passion for outdoor adventure and living in remote or isolated areas. I think it's tempting we associate Hemingway I think mostly with Paris. The reality, though, is that he spent most of his adult life outside of Havana and not even inside the city proper. After leaving Paris, he would never live in a truly big city again. So it's sort of a curious accident of history, that perception you associate him with Paris, but he didn't really spend all that much time there. He liked to live away from people. And of course, at a certain point, the degree of fame that he enjoyed mandated it. We're talking about Elvis levels of fame. We're talking about Kanye levels of fame. In Spain, he would be mobbed. And yeah, it was no writer alive enjoys the degree of notoriety that Hemingway did during his lifetime. All right. Hemingway attended Oak Park and River Forest High School in Oak Park from 1913 until 1917. He was this is where it gets a little mixed. Some accounts say he was mediocre. There's a 90-minute documentary, like a PBS, I think it's like a PBS documentary that one of his granddaughters narrates. And she talks about him being mediocre, I believe. The Wikipedia says he was a good athlete. He embellished.
Oh yeah.
And we're really going to get into this. He was involved in a number of sports: boxing, track and field, water polo, and football. He performed in the school orchestra for 2 years with his sister Marceline, and he received good grades in English classes. One of the biographies claims he was a mediocre athlete and would inflate his accomplishments. This is a lifelong theme for Hemingway. He was a fabulist, most of all around his own myth and legend. It's a cliche, but Hemingway very much created and cultivated a persona. And in a way, that persona, we may see in the course of this episode, consumed and might have finally destroyed him. And as Aaron so aptly mentioned at the top of the pod, he went viral before going viral was a thing. I believe John, when I spoke with him recently, John Rosengren, the journalist, mentioned the same thing. I've got another little bit of reading from the Lynn bio here about his first dates. All right. So we're talking about the time he was about 15. Let's see here. Back in Oak Park, there were perhaps as many as half a dozen girls who were Ernest's pals. He did not have his first date, though, until he was 15 and a half, when he escorted a freshman named Dorothy Davies to a basketball game. All his bachelor friends were nearly in a state of apoplexy over it, his mother remarked with amusement. Let's see here. The following May, he invited, and I think the implication is that there might have been some summer flings going on in Michigan. Michigan is for lovers. Up in Michigan. The following May, he invited Francis Coates over for a couple of moonlight canoe rides on the Des Plaines River. But his mother saw to it that he took his sister to the junior-senior prom on the 19th of that month. Ernest and Marceline went together. Also, Marceline had other invitations, Grace noted with satisfaction.
Why'd she make them go together? That's weird.
It's a little much, isn't it? Mom really wants...
I don't know what the conventions were back then, but
I think it's a matter of propriety. Your father is a doctor, and I am a musician. I am a thwarted musician. You children have thwarted my career, and I am a lady of Oak Park, and we are. Yes, indeed. I didn't pick out what denomination they are, but they're not Catholic. The One True Faith. But I think there's some sort of like high church. Yeah, sorry, I had to do it. Aaron, I'm by contract. I have to.
I know.
Had to be done. Hey, it's Lent, everybody. Very good. Okay, reading on here. To his friends, the adolescent Ernest liked to appear supremely self-assured, yet the expression on his face was often tense, and his sleep was often broken by nightmares. An especially bad one that had him yelling bloody murder occurred one night at Windermere after he and Marceline and another boy and girl stayed up late reading aloud to one another from Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Mm.
And with the girls of Oak Park High, he didn't compile much of a record in the role of a swain. We need to bring the word swain back. That's a great word. Wherefore his woodland trysts with Prudy Bolton. So there were these upstate Michigan trysts. Somehow he didn't feel threatened by her, possibly because she was of a lower class, possibly because she belonged to a conquered race. So Prudy must have been, well, in any case. So this is about his early romances. So are we getting a taste for Ernest?
Yeah, this is all kind of squaring now. It's interesting, I don't know that Ernest was the first performatively hyper-masculine man to have maybe be compensating for some childhood issues. It's very interesting. Sort of like Lovecraft a little bit. Lovecraft didn't have the performative hyper-masculinity, but as a boy was kind of treated like a girl, like Hemingway's mother treated him. So very interesting.
Do we know anything else really much about this tradition or this practice? It's just,
you always hear this like, oh, well, boys used to wear pink and wear girls' clothes. And I don't know if that's actually true or not, or if it's just isolated cases. I don't know.
I would see family photographs growing up of very, very small children. So this would have been my great uncles when they were infants in what looked like sort of like nightgowns, but I'm talking about babies, right? And once I just got the sense that it was easier to change kids when you were using cloth diapers without like little trousers.
Right.
And
you got you have a larger family, you've got a bunch of kids. You don't need buying them all new outfits for the first 6 months of their lives, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like some kind of like, big or not big, some little nightshirt for boys and girls sort of makes sense. When you have a bunch of kids, you can't afford it. My people were like, hill people in the Ozarks in Missouri at that point, right? And so they certainly didn't have, the resources to be going to. Well, I don't know if there was store-bought stuff for kids. Anyway.
Yeah. So that's a little different than, okay, we're a middle to upper middle class family, and we're gonna style our son's hair like a girl's until he's walking around. Yeah.
This is something I'm sorry, Kevin.
No, not at all. Go ahead, Aaron.
Oh, I was just going to say, film I really love, based on a Charlie Kaufman script about Chuck Barris called Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Barris finds out later in the film, or the Barris character, that his mother dressed him as a girl until he was, 5, 6, 7 years old.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. Fascinating. Very interesting. Yeah. I'm gonna go back a little bit in the Lynn bio because I want to cover this business with Prudy. It feels important. And some of the language in here might be the kind of thing that would be boulderized now by the AI. I'm just going to read it. Another of Ernest's Indian acquaintances was a muscular and thoroughly disagreeable lout named Nick Bolton, a sawyer by trade, whom Dr. Hemingway, and this is Ernest's father, sometimes hired to cut up the legs that drifted onto the Hemingway's beach from the big log booms that were forever being towed to a sawmill at the foot of Walloon Lake by a majestically slow-moving steamer called Magic. Most people would believe that Bolton was half Indian, changing what they used. Although some of the farmers around the lake were certain he was a white man. Bolton lived in the Indian settlement in the woods and had a son by one Native American woman. And a daughter. I am boulderizing it. Okay, all right, it's happening. And a daughter. You know what? With Hemingway, it's going to get real. Let's just say that. There's just no way to avoid it. And a daughter and a son by another. His daughter, Prudy, who is 3 years younger than Ernest, occasionally did housework at Windermere. One summer during his middle teens, Ernest frequently went hunting for black squirrels with Prudy and her brother Billy. Prudy may have fallen into the habit of putting an exploring hand in Ernest's pocket while the three of them sat quietly in the middle of the woods listening for squirrels in the top branches. She may even have lain on her back on a bed of pine needles and allowed Ernest to climb on top of her while Billy watched.
Okay.
And this would come out a little bit in the short stories. So
Yeah.
just a little touch of childhood, youthful shenanigans up in the woods, and trying to get a little bit of a color, trying to paint in Hemingway's sexuality and his psychology a bit. All right. During his last 2 years at high school, he edited the Trapeze and Tabula, the school's newspaper and yearbook, where he imitated the language of sports writers and used the pen name Ring Lardner Jr., a nod to Ring Lardner of the Chicago Tribune, whose byline was Linotype. Like Mark Twain, Stephen Crane, Theodore Dreiser, and Sinclair Lewis, Hemingway was a journalist before becoming a novelist. After leaving high school, he went to work for the Kansas City Star as a cub reporter. Although he stayed there for only 6 months, and this is critical, he relied on the Star's style guide as a foundation for his writing. Use short sentences, use short first paragraphs, use vigorous English, be positive, not negative. And this is critical to understanding Hemingway's effect on American and ultimately English language style, and probably even beyond English. He brought journalistic precision to literature and wrote stories anybody with a high school education could read and enjoy, with enough depth and nuance that the stories, the novels too, serve as a kind of bait and switch, right? You get sucked in by what appears to be an easy reading level. I don't know if y'all remember from grade school, they're all about reading levels. You should be reading at this level. They're reading at this. Okay. It's easy to read Hemingway. And then by the time you're done, you are absolutely destroyed by the metaphor and by what is left unsaid. And we're going to come to this in a few years when he began to write in earnest. Haha. Had to do it. Now, we're coming up to the big turn here. Well, Brad, what's coming up?
I mean,
what event?
World War I is on its way. Yeah.
And there it is in my outline.
Yeah.
So we're coming up to World War I. Hemingway suffered psychological wounds during his childhood that predated by many years the traumatic experiences he encountered in World Wars I and II and all his subsequent injuries. Dr. Clarence Hemingway was a strict, vicious disciplinarian who spanked his son and beat him at times with a razor strop. Ernest did not escape in an abusive, what we would call an abusive childhood. I'm going to read a little bit about this. A marvelous marksman, this is from the Lynn bio again, with both shotgun and rifle, an accomplished fisherman, a master of every technique for surviving in a wilderness, Dr. Hemingway was a complete woodsman. As the father of two boys born a decade and a half apart, he might have contented himself with passing on his lore to each of them in turn, but he was far too ebullient a teacher not to impart what he knew to his four girls as well, especially to Marceline, his first child, and to the tomboyish Madeline, his fourth, whom everyone called Sonny. Virtually everything that Dr. Hemingway taught his children to kill, he taught them to eat. Besides introducing them to such recognized culinary delights as venison, quail, partridge, dove, duck, turtle meat, frog's legs, and various kinds of fish, he persuaded them that stewed woodchuck was very similar in taste to stewed chicken, and that baked opossum with sweet potatoes around it was delicious. So he was he was a woodsman, and now we're going to get into a little bit of the physical stuff. It's interesting because I don't know, you think about a doctor in a Chicago suburb, but it's a different time too. One thing about Hemingway that I'm going to say is that it was not ever really a LARP. Like, you think we're going to come to the big sea fishing that he would eventually do. The man set world records.
Right? Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Yep. I mean, I'll get to it, but at one point he got 7 marlin in a day, and that broke the record. And he also, this is off Bimini, and he would also, or Bimini, and he would also, I mean, I think he broke a number of weight records, and he kind of changed the way that people did it, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, the man was the real article. Yeah. In any case, As Marceline phrased it, Daddy could make any walk a pleasure. But as she and her siblings learned the hard way, Dr. Hemingway's high spirits could disappear without warning. My father's dimpled cheeks and charming smile, said Marceline, could change in an instant to the stern, taut mouth and piercing look, which was his disciplinary self. Sometimes the change from being gay to being stern was so abrupt that we were not prepared for the shock that came. When 1 minute Daddy would have his arm around one of us, or we would be sitting on his lap laughing and talking, or a minute or so later, because of something we had said or done, or some neglected duty of ours he suddenly thought about, we would be ordered to our rooms and perhaps made to go without supper. Sometimes we were spanked hard, our bodies across his knee. Always after punishment, we were told to kneel down and ask God to forgive us. For serious infractions, she added, he went at them with a razor strop that he kept in the closet, washing their mouths out with bitter-tasting soap and refusing to speak to them for days at a time, were other devices he resorted to for making them pay for their transgressions. Their mother sometimes spanked them too. There were times when she even used her hairbrush instead of her hand. Nevertheless, her chastisements were not nearly as violent as those administered by her husband, and her anger was controlled, whereas his was explosive. That Dr. Hemingway had been a strict disciplinarian was the circular explanation for his appalling outbursts that Marceline would give in her memoir. Yeah. Well, in any case, that's what we were dealing with. Now,
Yeah.
tough. It's tough stuff. Also of a time. Right?
Yeah.
Physical discipline. I think if we saw that today, the three of us, we would be like, that's child abuse.
Yeah.
I grew up rural Oklahoma on a ranch. My friends and we still got whooping. I got switched by my grandmother. My granddad would, take off the belt. He never used it. It was just enough for him to take off the belt.
Right.
and sort of, do you want me to take my belt off was a thing that, fathers and granddads said. But I never saw them or my friends' parents out of control. And I never saw them discipline their kids in that way, however you want to talk about corporal punishment, whatever, in anger. It was never this kind of explosive rage. And so that the use of explosive, Kevin, when you said that, hit me as being okay, that's scary.
Yeah, there is something different about a little bit of physicality as a part of a deliberate discipline regime. And you can say it's wrong still, but that versus just getting the crap kicked out of you because dad's mad about something.
That's very different.
Yeah, right. Because it's a much scarier environment. It's a psychodrama instead of a military camp or whatever.
And
yeah.
I don't know. And Kevin, with your experience too, I was raised a blue collar kid, raised by my grandparents. My granddad was a welder and a pipeliner. And all my friends were, blue collar working class kids. And I don't know why. I don't know why this is the case. To me, it seems somehow more terrifying to think of being physically disciplined by a doctor or a lawyer than it does by a carpenter. And I can't say why I feel that way. Do you guys know what I mean? Is anything there?
Well, do no harm. Dr. Hemingway.
Yeah, right. It's out of step with what one expects from, a quote unquote, professional.
Yeah, there's it's supposed to be a higher standard or something.
Right.
Though we know there really isn't.
There really isn't, of course. But that class thing definitely was even more prominent then. Right.
Yeah. I took some whoopings for sure from my for sure.
I never took one myself, and this is my own experience. I never took one that I thought that was
Right.
across the line. I felt
Sure.
like, oh, I'm glad they didn't know what else I did.
Right.
I felt like I was quite deserving, and they were pretty restrained.
Right. Yeah. If you're in that situation where it's like, yeah, I probably had that coming, then it doesn't feel as traumatic
different.
as if, it's
like,
wild and unpredictable.
I was in grade school and high school in the 70s, and through the 80s. I graduated in 90. We got licks at school still. I mean, I know that.
Oh, really?
If that happened, they'd call the Pope in to do an exorcism.
Right.
But we still got beat. Not beat. I shouldn't say that. We still got swatted by the principal.
Really?
And then you had one principal, like he had like speed holes drilled in his paddle and all this. How much of that is the embellishment of kids talking about, if you go see Mr. Gunter, he's really going to lay into you. And how much of that is like, I got swatted in 7th grade. It was no big deal. And I was so relieved that it didn't hurt that I laughed while Mr. Lindemann was swatting me. Just nervous energy. And he said, "Don't laugh. I'll really let you have it." I was like, no, I'm good. I'm good, man.
Yeah.
That's a tremendous insight about the high contrast of it. This idea that it's somehow more garish, or it feels more inappropriate from a doctor somehow. But maybe there's a tinge of sort of classism there that we've just internalized as well. But I think it's a very interesting insight.
So.
Yeah. Well, cool. Hemingway would visit the rage that his parents evidenced to him right back in return. The young Hemingway developed such rage that he adopted a ritual in which he played out an assassination fantasy against his abusive father. At the age of 18, Ernest would hide in a backyard shed and draw a bead on the doctor's head with a loaded shotgun.
Whoa.
Yeah. That's something I did not do. I didn't know, putting a gun on somebody.
Yeah.
I was,
loaded.
Yeah. No, all three of us have, grew up handling firearms. And the first thing is, don't ever point a gun at something you don't wish to destroy. And I'm sure Hemingway was taught that too, but he did it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Reading from the Lynn bio, young Ernest's view of his father gradually ceased to be worshipful. At first, his adolescent rebellion against the hero of his childhood followed a normal developmental pattern for boys of his age. The estrangement between them was encouraged by Dr. Hemingway's decision in 1911, after Grace gave birth to baby Carol, that as the father of 5 children, he would no longer afford to take long vacations at Windermere, thus reducing drastically the amount of time he and Ernest were able to spend in one another's company in the woods. Far more significant, though, was Ernest's growing realization of his father's degrading subservience to Grace, for it resulted in a loss of respect, which was then intensified by Dr. Hemingway's abject departure from home in 1912 to take a rest cure for his nerves. And working within Ernest's new attitude of condescension toward his father was a swelling anger about his disciplinarianism. Nick Adams' characterization, and Nick Adams is the stand-in for Hemingway in the short stories, of Fortitude as the book in which the boy's old man is after him all the time was no accident. There was no aspect of Peter Westcott's experience with which Ernest more fervently identified. And these are characters from the short stories. Unfortunately, the feelings that made for trouble between son and father were never resolved. To the contrary, Ernest's condescension and anger grew abnormally stronger with each passing year, which suggests that another sort of emotion was involved. From the tool shed behind Windermere, he could observe his father sweatily at work in his sunlit tomato patch. In the summer that Ernest turned 18, so he later confided to Bill Smith, he occasionally sat quietly in the doorway of the shed with a loaded shotgun beside him, and from time to time would pick up the gun and carefully draw a bead on his father's head. Perhaps these mock assassinations arose out of a boy's desire to destroy the man he feared he himself would one day become.
Sure.
Little taste of things to come. Little foreshadowing.
That's heavy.
All right. Well, I did say we would get to the writing, but first, Ernest goes to war. And in December of 1917, after being rejected by the U.S. Army for poor eyesight, maybe something that runs in the family, mentioned his mother, Hemingway responded to a Red Cross recruitment effort and signed on to be an ambulance driver in Italy. In May of 1918, he sailed from New York and arrived in Paris as the city was under bombardment from German artillery. That June, he arrived at the Italian front. On his first day in Milan, he was sent to the scene of a munitions factory explosion to join rescuers retrieving the shredded remains of female workers. He described the incident in his 1932 nonfiction book, Death in the Afternoon, and this is him. I remember that after we searched quite thoroughly for the complete dead, we collected fragments. There were 35 dead, and he described seeing the corpse of a headless, legless woman. 18 years old. A few days later, he was stationed at Fasolta di Piave in the north of Italy, near Venice and the Alps, in the fight against the Austrians. He drove an ambulance and for the first time experienced the camaraderie of war among the fellow ambulance corps. He wanted to be near the action, so volunteered to bicycle up to the trenches to distribute candy and cigarettes to a forward listening post. This is in the evening. This is at night. A mortar exploded 3 feet away. One soldier was killed outright, and another had his legs blown off. 220 shards of shrapnel hit Hemingway. And he would, I think I have a note about this, but I'm going to want to get it in. He would keep these shards of shrapnel, and he had them as memento mori, I suppose. And he would make little jewelry out of them. I think he would wear them as necklaces and things.
Wow. This is concussion number 1, too. This couldn't be more like significant to where we're headed. You know, this is the first time he was concussed. We know a lot more about TBI, traumatic brain injuries, than we, and so concussions are a problem, obviously, but repeated concussions and concussions that aren't separated by a period of rest for the brain are particularly dangerous and cause deterioration. Anyways,
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, there's no question that he had TBI, and thanks for calling that out, Aaron. You predicted what I was going to say next. They also say it's sort of like, is it called subconcussive or something? It's like not quite a mortar shell, but even little things like a jab to the head, boxing, sport, football.
Sure.
And one thing we'll come to much later, but we're talking about friend of the pod, John Rosengren, the journalist, in those final pictures of Hemingway. He said he could not believe that he was only 61 at the time. He looked like a man of 80. And who knows, that could have had something to do with these brain injuries, which we will track in exhaustive detail on this episode of Art of Darkness. All right.
Could I pop in with just a paragraph from one of Hemingway's letters to Scott Fitzgerald in December of 29?
Do it.
So to the boxing thing and to the damage that causes. One of the first times I ever boxed, a fellow named Morty Helnick. After the bell for the end of the round, I dropped my hands. The minute I dropped my hands, he hit me with a right swing full to the pit of the stomach. After the fight, I was sick for nearly a week. The second time I boxed him, I was winning easily. He had the fight anyway, so he fouled me deliberately. Never had such pain in my life. One ball swelled up nearly big as a fist. That is the way boxing is. Look, in so-called friendly bouts, you are never trying to knock them out, yet you never know but that they will knock you out. You get completely the habit of suspicion. Boxing in the gym with a fellow, he let his thumb stick out beyond his gloves. The thumb caught me in the left eye, and I was blinded by it. He blinded in his life at least 4 men. Never intentionally, just the byproduct of a dirty trick.
Jeez.
Yeah. Again, not a LARP. He actually boxed. This wasn't. These weren't like friendly spars. I mean, he would go at people. And, for real.
Huh.
All right, back in World War I. Thank you, Aaron. And Aaron's going to be reading some of Hemingway for us as we go along. Despite his wounds, Hemingway assisted Italian soldiers to safety, for which he was decorated with the Italian War Merit Cross. So he was decorated at 18 by the Italian military for his service. And this is another point of embellishment. If you listen to him, well, I'll get into it. Again, he's still only 18. He later said of the incident, "When you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion of immortality. Other people get killed, not you. Then, when you are badly wounded the first time, you lose the illusion and you know it can happen to you." He sustained severe shrapnel wounds to both legs, underwent an immediate operation at a distribution center, and spent 5 days at a field hospital before he was transferred for recuperation to the Red Cross Hospital in Milan. He spent 6 months at the hospital, where he met and formed a strong friendship with Chink Dorman Smith that lasted for decades, and shared a room with future American Foreign Service officer, ambassador, and author Henry Serrano Villard. While recuperating, he fell in love with Agnes von Kurowski. This is the first real love, a Red Cross nurse 7 years his senior. When Hemingway returned to the U.S. in January of 1919, he believed Agnes would join him within months and the two would marry. 7 years his senior, and a nurse in Italy, who I think...
Is this like one of those situations where like the waitress is nice to you, so you think
she reciprocated. She leads him on a little bit, and I think she may have even been engaged to a doctor, but then ended up settling or marrying someone else. We'll get to it. He received a hero's welcome in the U.S. A reporter from the New York Sun met him in New York City, and he made headlines in New York, and I assume in Chicago. In Oak Park, he received a hero's welcome and embellished his war stories locally for a fee. He spoke in front of various civic and veterans groups and so forth. It really got to his head. He claimed he managed to carry an injured man to safety, which isn't really verifiable. He was also blown up. And he also claimed that he fought alongside an elite unit before the shooting stopped.
Here we go.
He's on a little bicycle with candy and cigarettes, right? I imagine a little bell on it. Ding, ding, ding.
Yep.
Fellas, I got your
chocolate.
candy.
Yeah. If you're feeling cynical, you could say he lied. If you're feeling generous, you could say he was a natural storyteller.
I like that. I like that. Can we? Would it be to just inject a hair about World War I real quick?
Do it. Bring it on.
So it's very hard to put ourselves back in the headspace of trench warfare and the kind of casualties that we're seeing and how dangerous this is, right? And this is before antibiotics, right? So there was still no good germ theory. Or at least there was, no treatment for sepsis. That didn't come till right before World War II, right? The carnage was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. At Passchendaele and Ypres, there were 1,000 bodies per square foot.
Yeah.
Right. So that kind of horror. Right. And, Hemingway, of course, didn't see that. He saw a different front, but he still saw real fighting. He still saw real combat. And I'd forgotten that he went so late. Right. This is 1914 to 1918. So he just got a taste before the armistice was signed, which is, I don't know. I just found that fascinating. I thought just eject a little historical, a little more context on that.
I appreciate that. You're right. He is right at the end. Yeah, when you said 1899, or a little earlier on, I started doing some math. I was like, wow, how is he in World War I? He's like barely old enough to.
Barely got there before it ended, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is a motif that would go on throughout his life. Hemingway and war are unavoidable. You can't really talk about the 20th century and the way it was covered and handled without talking about Hemingway, and you can't talk about Hemingway's life without talking about the various wars. Thank you, Aaron.
Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
No, do not apologize. You are here for a reason. Friend of the pod, Aaron Gwyn.
Love
great
it.
Aaron Gwyn. Hemingway received a letter in March. Ernie, dear boy, I am writing this late at night after a long think to myself, and I am afraid it is going to hurt you, but I'm sure it won't harm you permanently. For quite a while before you left, I was trying to convince myself it was a real love affair, because we always seemed to disagree, and then arguments always wore me out, so that I finally gave in to keep you from doing something desperate. Now, after a couple of months away from you, I know that I am still very fond of you, but it is more as a mother than as a sweetheart. It's all right to say I'm a kid. That was his nickname for her, but I'm not, and I'm getting less and less so every day. So kid, still kid to me, and always will be. Can you forgive me someday for unwittingly deceiving you? You know I'm not really bad, and I don't mean to do wrong, and now I realize it was my fault in the beginning that you cared for me and regret it from the bottom of my heart. But I am now and always will be too old, and that's the truth. And I can't get away from the fact that you're just a boy, a kid. I somehow feel that someday I'll have reason to be proud of you, but dear boy, I can't wait for that day, and it was wrong to hurry a career. I tried hard to make you understand a bit of what I was thinking on that trip from Padua to Milan, but you acted like a spoiled child, and I couldn't keep on hurting you. Now I only have the courage because I'm far away. Then, and believe me when I say this is sudden for me too, I expect to be married soon. And I hope and pray that after you've thought things out, you'll be able to forgive me and start a wonderful career and show what a man you really are. Ever admiringly and fondly, your friend, Aggie.
That's the Michael Jordan of fucking Dear John letters. That is I'm sorry. Every time you think, oh my gosh, it gets worse. It gets worse. He comes back and does a fucking 360 and dunks it and breaks the backboard. I mean, how do you fucking survive that? Good grief.
Absolutely bodied.
Yeah.
Bodied. And in a letter.
A
very succinctly written, a letter that in a way it is in the Hemingway style.
Kind of, yeah.
There was no
amazing
filigree. There's not a word, an extra word in there.
Not a lot of wishy-washiness. Not a lot of
Yep. And for young people, and I guess even older people, you think about yourself and your life, and you think, oh, I'll never be Hemingway, and I'll never match him. Even Hemingway got friend zoned. All right,
hard.
So hard, yeah. And that letter is savage.
Brutal.
Oof. She knew what she was doing too. I mean, that she could have been a lot gentler. I think there's a lot of bite in that letter.
The boy thing, right? The constant infantilization of him really hit me hard. Just, the repetition of, I'm a woman and you're a boy and you're a boy and you're a boy. I'm like, whoo, your friend. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Whoa, doggy. Yeah,
whoa, doggy indeed.
She thought about that.
She thought about it.
Yeah. And she hints at these arguments that they had. So I think she finally had her chance to just, rip the Band-Aid off. Yeah.
And this is how Gamergate started, right here.
Once again, nothing changes. All right, moving along. Nothing changes. Biographer Jeffrey Myers writes, Agnes's rejection devastated and scarred the young man. In future relationships, Hemingway followed a pattern of abandoning a wife before she abandoned him, with one notable exception, which we'll come to. That was a serious love affair, and this is his first heartbreak, which coincided with his first really serious physical injuries. So it must have been an absolutely heady time. His legs were torn up. He very well could have died. The heartbreak literally gave him a fever. He started drinking liquor, and he described the way that he got over it was cognac and two girls he violently rushed. He called it cauterization.
Oh my god!
Whoa.
Mhm. Yeah.
What does violently rushed mean?
Yeah, that's what I was like, does everybody else know what that means? I don't know.
I'm gonna think it was just some sort of maybe not even a euphemism. I can't talk. It's not even a euphemism. It's like a hyper euphemism.
Yeah.
Oh my god, euphemism.
Yeah.
But in any case,
Wow.
yeah, violently rushed.
Hashtag me too.
Hashtag violently rushed.
Good grief.
Yeah, good grief is right. Again, and we've yet to touch on this. And I think maybe we'll leave a little bit of time in the After Dark to talk about the recent boulderization of the Roald Dahl and how. Let's actually frame this right now. Hemingway was left in. Conrad was removed and replaced with Steinbeck. Now, let's just remember that as we go along and describe the life of Hemingway. And it really does make one wonder. It really, truly does. They got rid of Kipling. They got rid of Conrad. Conrad doesn't stay in, right? Hemingway stays in. And I don't think, I mean, we covered Conrad. I don't think in Conrad's personal life, there was anything remotely as
he was he had moments of being a bit of a jerk, but there was no like there's nothing that he could have been brought up on charges for.
Right. And with Hemingway, there will be. We're going to see. There will be. All right. So we'll talk about that a little more in the After Dark. I'm sure we all share the same opinion on that matter. Yeah. In any case, what does a young writer do, a young man do, when he's been to war, received a hero's welcome, kind of lied about it, gets his first heartbreak, starts drinking? What's he going to do? He's going to start writing.
Better.
Yeah, he'd better. That's right. So he started writing short stories, and he received rejections from the Saturday Evening Post and Redbook. Hemingway got friend zoned, and Hemingway got rejections. There's hope for you. And to sort of deepen it a little more, he was messed up at this point. At night, he needed a light. He had been wounded at night. He was traumatized. Ursula would sleep in his room, and he was frightened of sleeping alone. Like henceforth, this is one of the reasons he always had a new woman lined up after he had burned all of his credit with the previous one.
There's that
again,
great... I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
Not at all.
There's that great sentence that Jake Barnes thinks at the end of that chapter in Sun Also Rises, where he runs Brett back home, and he comes home and he needs to go to sleep, but he lies there in the dark, and then he lights a lamp, and he says, it's all well and good to be hard-boiled about something in daylight, but at nighttime it is another matter. So like it got to his characters as well.
Yeah. Hemingway returned home in 1919 to a time of readjustment. Before the age of 20, he had gained from the war a maturity that was at odds with living at home without a job and with the need for recuperation. One of his biographers explains, Hemingway could not really tell his parents what he thought when he saw his bloody knee. He was not able to tell them how scared he had been in another country with surgeons who could not tell him in English if his leg was coming off or not. In September, he took a fishing and camping trip with high school friends to the backcountry of Michigan's Upper Peninsula.
Oh, he was speaking of Uper.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yep. The trip became the inspiration for his short story, Big Two-Hearted River, in which the semi-autobiographical character Nick Adams takes to the country to find solitude after returning from war. A family friend offered him a job in Toronto, and with nothing else to do, he accepted. I think a lot of people end up in Toronto like that. Shout out to Toronto. Yes, we love you. It's all good. I really want to visit Toronto. I'm very curious.
I bet it's beautiful, actually.
Yeah, I bet it is.
I bet it's gorgeous.
Yeah, we love our Canadian friends and listeners.
It's a cool city.
Is it? Oh, yeah. Cool. Yeah. Late that year, he began as a freelancer and staff writer for the Toronto Star Weekly. He returned to Michigan the following June and then moved to Chicago in September of 1920 to live with friends while still filing stories for the Toronto Star. Around this time, he takes a trip to Walloon Lake in Michigan with his family. There are arguments. He's 21 years old. There's a secret moonlight party with his sisters. His mother is furious. She calls him a disgrace. My dear son, Ernest, she wrote in a letter, a mother's love is like a bank. And she said, you have overdrawn. This letter is heavy. She's like, it's time for you to start depositing some love and some respect into this relationship. She wrote him.
There's nothing good that comes from a mother's letter after she uses a simile on you, man. There's nothing you should not read on.
Right.
Mother's love is like a bank.
Nope. I mean, I don't have this entire letter, but this is a savage and rather famous letter, and comparable to the breakup. So the would-be wife writes you the Michael Jordan of breakup letters and says she feels like a mother. Then your mother says, son, I'm like a bank and you've overdrawn. I mean, this is the women in your life. You're having a rough time. Not good. Probably going to lead to some complications down the way. What do you boys think?
It might.
In Chicago, he worked as an associate editor of the monthly journal Cooperative Commonwealth, where he met novelist Sherwood Anderson. When St. Louis native Hadley Richardson came to Chicago to visit the sister of Hemingway's roommate, Hemingway became infatuated. And here we are. Ding, 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 ding. Wife numero uno, Elizabeth Hadley Richardson. Come on down. You're on Hemingway's wife. Yeah, so she would be the first Hemingway wife, 28 years old from St. Louis.
Wait, how old was she?
28.
So she was the same age as Agnes.
Yeah, he was attracted to older women here.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. So, yeah, sort of interesting. He's only 21. Maybe it has something to do with the sister who was older and who was... There could be some weird Freudian thing there.
Could be.
That, or he probably felt a little older than his age because of the fact that he had been to war.
Right.
And he's obviously, the other thing you have to say, Hemingway was a genius. There's no question he was a genius.
Absolutely.
I mean, a world-changing genius. Hadley's alcoholic father shot himself when she was 13, and she had a sister who burned to death in a fire.
Oh my God.
Now, she had a trust fund. All right, so Hadley's a trust fund kid, not giga wealthy, but comfortable wealthy, to the point where Hemingway's claims of poverty in Paris are all horseshit.
That's correct.
They had money.
Correct.
They always had money to go out and drink. They had money to buy paintings that would later become invaluable. They never really wanted for anything. He played it up. She had a mental breakdown when she was at Bryn Mawr.
That's right.
And her mother had died weeks before she met Hemingway. Within 6 weeks of meeting one another, they were talking of marriage. They wrote each other almost daily. She once wrote him, "We're the same firm." So this is how people talk to each other back then. I am like a bank. We are the same firm, you and I.
Amazing.
She sent him a new Corona typewriter, and he later claimed, "I knew she was the girl I was going to marry." Hadley, red-haired with a nurturing instinct, which he desperately needs, was 8 years older than Hemingway. Despite the age difference, Hadley, who had grown up with an overprotective mother, seemed less mature than usual for a young woman her age. Bernice Kurt, author of The Hemingway Women, claims Hadley was evocative of Agnes, but that Hadley had a childishness that Agnes lacked. Probably coddled.
Yeah.
The two corresponded for a few months and then decided to marry and travel to Europe. They wanted to visit Rome, but Sherwood Anderson convinced them to visit Paris instead, writing letters of introduction for the young couple. They were married on September 3rd of 1921. 2 months later, Hemingway was hired as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star, and the couple left for Paris. I think he kind of hated the editor of the Toronto Star. He probably worked with multiple ones, but I think he was ready to move past journalism pretty quickly. Although he would write journalism most of his life. I mean, he became a war correspondent later, and in fact, he became the highest paid correspondent until up to that time. This would come later. Of Hemingway's marriage to Hadley, Myers claims, with Hadley, Hemingway achieved everything he had hoped for with Agnes: the love of a beautiful woman, a comfortable life, or a comfortable income, and a life in Europe. And that brings us to the next section of this outline that I have for this core episode of Art of Darkness. Paris. Are you ready? Excited?
Let's do
it. The gay Paris, the city of lights. And here we are, the myth. And wouldn't you love to just teleport to Paris circa 1923 and wander the streets? And
it sounds awesome. Yeah.
What a crew. Joyce.
We're getting into it.
Eliot, Stein. Like heavy hitters, man.
And we'll get to it. I mean, I think Stein said somebody said Paris is where the modern world is, something to that effect. I have the note. All right. Carlos Baker, Hemingway's first biographer, believes that Anderson suggested Paris because the monetary exchange rate made it an inexpensive place to live. More importantly, it was where the most interesting people in the world lived. Now they're all on podcasts.
Yeah,
that's right.
In the podcast archipelago. In Paris, Hemingway met American writer and art collector Gertrude Stein, Irish novelist James Joyce, American poet Ezra Pound, who could help a young writer up the rungs of a career, and other writers, all people we will cover. The Hemingway of the early Paris years was we've already covered Joyce, was a tall, handsome, muscular, broad-shouldered, brown-eyed, rosy-cheeked, square-jawed, soft-voiced young man. Hemingway was a catch.
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture of him from 1923. He looks handsome. He looks intense too.
He never took a bad picture. Every picture you see of Hemingway, it's like, that's a great picture.
Yeah. Interesting.
I mean, and women would describe him as just like a hunk. He was a piece you'd want to take a bite off that cake.
He was a dime piece, as they say.
There you go.
The dime piece.
There you go. Very
well,
good.
And you show up in Paris, and he's an American, right? And there's always some allure to the other side. He's a sort of a interesting. Yes, and of course, he's got his new wife, so I suppose he's not chasing.
Fair enough. Yeah, sure. We'll come to it. He and Hadley lived in a small walk-up at 74 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine in the Latin Quarter, and he worked in a rented room in a nearby building. Again, poverty, you can rent a room. Okay. Yeah. Stein, who was the bastion of modernism in Paris, became Hemingway's mentor and godmother to his son, Jack. We'll get to Bumby here in a minute. She introduced him to the expatriate artists and writers of the Montparnasse Quarter, whom she referred to as the Lost Generation, a term Hemingway popularized with the publication of The Sun Also Rises. A regular at Stein's salon, Hemingway met influential painters such as Pablo Picasso, Joan Moreau, and Juan Gris. He eventually withdrew from Stein's influence, and their relationship deteriorated into a literary quarrel that spanned decades. While living in Paris in 1922, Hemingway befriended artist Henry Strader, who painted 2 portraits of him. Ezra Pound met Hemingway by chance at Sylvia Beach's bookshop, Shakespeare and Company, in 1922. The two toured Italy in 1923 and lived on the same street in 1924. They forged a strong friendship, and in Hemingway, Pound recognized and fostered a young talent. Now, I want to get to the writing and the iceberg theory, which Brad already mentioned. Maybe, Aaron, if you had to describe the iceberg theory, how would you describe it to someone who doesn't know this?
The idea as it is proposed is that you are trying to write in a way that is hyper-specific and hyper-concrete. And by concrete, I mean sensory detail of the senses, of the 5 senses. And you're writing in a way that the reservoir of emotion, the types of things that were put on the page in the purple prose of the Victorian novel are reserved and gestured at. So the words on the page, the finely crafted, chiseled prose that appears on the pages of Hemingway's stories and novels is just the part of the iceberg that sticks up above the water. But you can meditate on those perfect sentences, the so-called muscular prose, and underneath is what is not seen, which is the bulk of the iceberg and the emotional depth, the psychic and psychological depth. And so that's as I understand it, that is the great iceberg theory of Hemingway's writing.
Brad, do you co-sign that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent description. Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
All right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so I want to read a little bit more here about it. In 1923, Hemingway conceived of the idea of a new theory of writing after finishing the short story Out of Season. In A Movable Feast, which was published posthumously, it's the memoir about his years as a young writer in Paris, he explains, I omitted the real end of Out of Season, which was that the old man hanged himself. This was omitted in my new theory that you could omit anything, and the omitted part would strengthen the story. In chapter 16 of Death in the Afternoon, he compares his theory about writing to an iceberg. Carlos Baker, his first biographer, believed that as a writer of short stories, Hemingway learned how to get the most from the least, how to prune language and avoid wasted motion, how to multiply intensities, and how to tell nothing but the truth in a way that allows for telling more than the truth. Baker also notes that the writing style of the iceberg theory suggests that the story's narrative and nuanced complexities, complete with symbolism, operate under the surface of the story itself. So in a way, he's echoing psychoanalysis and the birth of psychology. A lot of this stuff, though, he describes when they describe right here how to get the most from the least, how to prune language. That's something that an editor at a newspaper would teach you to do. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of combination of this like low to middle brow journalism, right? This quotidian day-to-day, hey, how do you tell the story to somebody who's in sixth grade, who got a sixth grade education? That was our readers, it's you got that pruning, but then elevated by this understanding of subconscious realities and
right with the depths that you can hint at without pointing at them, right. And I think this is something that gets kind of lost in thinking about Hemingway and the way that Hemingway's influences has kind of radiated out. There's this notion that he's extremely economical, which he is, and then the sort of the not so successful aping of Hemingway, of trying to be like Hemingway, happens when you just try to write economical and don't recognize that Hemingway's deliberately leaving out stuff that he knows and trying to suggest it and hint at it in a rich way. He's not just writing clipped, efficient sentences to convey an action, right? He knows everything that's happening. And if he wanted to, he could have described every possible physical and emotional detail. But the idea is, I'm gonna make 3 lines and you're gonna see an entire landscape kind of thing. And that's where I see, I have thoughts about style, obviously, and I'm sure Aaron's got thoughts that are some of them are the same, some of them are different. But that's what I see as the profound innovation of the Hemingway style. But you have to take the whole thing if you're really going to try and lean on that Hemingway style as a writer.
Well, and also, when Hemingway's style is often described by his detractors, you'll get this description of it as being simple and plain and this sort of thing. First paragraph of A Farewell to Arms. We'll see if this actually
is simple.
Yeah. In the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plains to the mountains. In the bed of the river, there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels. Troops went by the house, and down the road in the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees, too, were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year, and we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising and leaves stirred by the breeze, falling, and the soldiers marching, and afterward the road bare and white except for the leaves. Now, I would submit that that is not the prose of simple, pared down. That is an elegant, lyrical, but absolutely necessary prose that is informed by, as Kevin said, journalism, as other thing, what you were talking about, Brad, but is also informed by the rhythms of the King James Bible, particularly in the Old Testament. The constant and
the one, my favorite, just syntactical little stylistic thing in there. I mean, that's a gorgeous passage. I'm
really pretty.
But one of my favorite little syntactical things is when he says, I might get it not quite right. And the trees too were dusty.
Yes.
There's something about that turn that is like, oh, we're not, this isn't a newspaper article. Like if you were under the illusion that you were just dealing with the encyclopedia entry to something, you suddenly are, that little twist for me actually seals the whole thing in as this as like a piece of poetic, a little mini poetic masterpiece.
I agree. And whereas good newspaper writing, has one plane, and that is the plane of the visual. That day we saw the tanks roll in, to Paris, and we saw the men, right? And that can be rich and interesting. But in the paragraph I just read, you get the planes of the way the dust smelled and the sound of the men marching, and right, you're getting all this sensory depth, which you don't get in the average newspaper article.
Right.
Now I want to pause here because you brought up the good book, Aaron, and I did a little bit of on the fly research here. Hemingway was raised in a Congregationalist Protestant home, and his first conversion to Catholicism occurred when he was a 19-year-old and a volunteer ambulance driver in Italy during World War I. Now, I've heard this told different ways. I am on angelusnews.com. I am on there's an ad for Catholic cemeteries and mortuaries on the right, which I may click later. And
you never know when you're going to need that.
That's correct. That's so true. But in any case, and we're going to get to it, but this is a very interesting article. So they retell the story of how he was injured. Now, I knew an Italian priest recovered his body, and I knew he had received last rites. But I remember reading that too. He was also baptized on the battlefield. Okay. So later, because his second wife, who is lurking in the background even now, came from a very well-to-do, extremely well-to-do Catholic family I believe in St. Louis or in Arkansas. And that became, he ends up converting for her. But according to he would later say, I've been a Catholic since I was blown up in Italy. Right? Because a priest gave me the last rites. Here's his description of it. A big Austrian trench mortar bomb of the type that used to be called ash cans exploded in the darkness. I died then. I felt my soul or something coming right out of my body, like you'd pull a silk handkerchief out of a pocket by one corner. It flew around and then came back and went in again, and I wasn't dead anymore. After having been anointed, Hemingway described himself as becoming a super Catholic. It was a near-death experience that changed the course of his life. After the war, he went to work, and ate. Okay, we'll get into it.
I like the idea of him calling himself a super Catholic. Like he immediately becomes well, listen, I'm the most Catholic person, just like
you think you're Catholic,
right? I became a Catholic on the battlefield.
I was on the verge of death. Yeah. You call that Catholicism?
That is so funny, Aaron, because it's quite like that. In a lot of ways.
Amazing.
It really can be. I'm bookmarking this page, the troubled Catholicism of Ernest Hemingway, and bookmarked, saved.
Yeah, there you go.
Very good, very exciting. But yeah, and of course he must have been raised with the Bible in the house, and
Had to have been.
had to have been. And Gwyn, you got a little. I'm glad you read from that. That's a great example. I want to come back to that great novel when we arrive to it chronologically. Did you have a selection, anything from any of the short stories that you
Absolutely right
Okay,
here?
bring
I'll
it.
tell you what I'll share is in his first collection, which is called In Our Time. The stories are separated by these small pieces of fiction that are often just a paragraph in length. And I think Brad and I were trained to call things like these, flash fiction or prose poems or microfiction. Here's just very short, but in line with what we were just talking about, and no title, just italicized paragraphs in between the stories. We were in a garden at Mons. Young Buckley came in with his patrol from across the river. The first German I saw climbed up over the garden wall. He waited till he got one leg over, and we waited until he got one leg over and then potted him. He had so much equipment on and looked awfully surprised and fell down into the garden. Then 3 more came over further down the wall. We shot them. They all came just like that.
Yeah.
Right. So the obvious thing that is left out is, well, how does the narrator feel about shooting these Germans? What is it like when, you quote pot a guy?
Right. But see how all those things are baked into the syntax and the diction without actually saying them. Right. Even we were in the garden. That's how you start to tell a story about a dream you had last night.
Right.
So the Bible
just kind of happened. Right. It just kind of, you don't say how you got there or what happened afterward. It's just like, we were in the garden. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. That's a beautiful little piece. I forgot about those interstitial pieces in that book.
They're interesting, and it's interesting that they're not titled. It's interesting that there's no sort of context for these. They're generally about World War I, and you turn the page on Big Two-Hearted River or Indian Camp or any of these, fantastic first stories, and then there are these pieces. And I cannot help but think of the kinds of things Ezra Pound is doing to the poetry of T.S. Eliot. If you've seen the first draft of The Wasteland, the first page in the facsimile edition has a big red X through it, where Pound just like cut all of this. Next page, big X. And then he crosses out Eliot's title, which is terrible, and writes The Wasteland.
What was Eliot's title? Do you remember?
We Do the Policemen in Different Voices.
No.
Isn't that terrible?
That's awful.
It's awful. It's from Dickens' Our Mutual Friend. And
The Wasteland is like, this is a book of the Bible or something.
Exactly.
Right? Like, yeah.
No, I mean, like, Pound is like, fuck that shit. It's called The Wasteland. So we do the policemen in different voices. That's horrible.
It sounds like a line Beckett would cut from one of his worst plays.
Right. Absolutely. And by the way, just very quickly, one paragraph about this Ezra Pound guy who is sort of without analog today. I mean, this guy was like a literary producer. Like he was like, Harvey Weinstein without the stuff that we now think of with Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah, sure. So Aaron's taking us to Pound Town.
Uh-oh. Pound Town, here we go. Kevin Birmingham's book about Ulysses, the most dangerous book, a paragraph about Ezra. Ezra Pound pushed the furniture to the edges of the study in Sussex so that he would have enough room to teach William Butler Yeats how to fence. Pound would lunge and retreat across the room while Yeats, 20 years his senior, would slash the air with his foil. They'd met in London in 1909, shortly after Pound published his first collection of poetry. A glowing review appeared in London's Evening Standard, quote, wild and haunting stuff, absolutely poetic, originally imaginative, passionate, spiritual. Those who do not consider it crazy may well consider it inspired. Words are no good describing it, end quote. Pound had written the review himself.
Dynamite. Well, that's very funny because
we could use an Ezra Pound these days.
Exactly.
Just like balls out. And Ezra Pound's one of those guys, brilliant writer, no question about it. But like his star on the Walk of Fame is secure, even if all of his writing had disappeared.
A genius editor.
Yeah,
a genius editor and promoter, enormous. Right? Mm-hmm. And knew how to bring the best out of so many of those guys. And, people like Stein is like, okay, this guy has real talent. This guy is a genius at promotion. Probably the closest thing we've had to an Ezra Pound in our lifetimes is Gordon Lish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the work with Raymond Carver.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Very interesting. We will cover Pound on a future Art of Darkness episode.
Oh, yeah, because there's darkness. There's a lot of darkness.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes. The boys go to Pound Town. All right. So there we go. Pound introduced Hemingway to James Joyce, with whom Hemingway frequently embarked on alcoholic sprees. During his first 20 months in Paris, Hemingway filed 88 stories for the Toronto Star. He covered the Greco-Turkish War, where he witnessed the burning of Smyrna, and wrote travel pieces such as Tuna Fishing in Spain and Trout Fishing all across Europe. Spain has the best, then Germany. Hemingway was devastated on learning that Hadley had lost, and this is serious, lost a suitcase filled with his manuscripts at the Gare de Lyon as she was traveling to Geneva to meet him in December of 1922. Nearly all of Hemingway's early writing, his juvenilia and apprentice fiction, including the duplicates, was lost. Back your shit up.
Back that shit up.
Back that shit
up.
Ass.
Don't better back that ass.
That's it. Back that ass up.
Now the next thing is, did he immediately throw Hadley into the river, or like what? I mean, no one would react well to this. No one on Earth would react well to it. He
describes it in, I don't have the excerpt right now, but he described it in A Movable Feast, how devastated he was. He forgave her verbally, but inside he just harbored this. Like,
that's one of those. It's fine.
Horror. It's fine. It'll be fine. It's just juvenilia. It's just juvenilia.
I think that scene. I think of like Pulp Fiction, where Bruce Willis where his girlfriend tells him that she left the watch. Right. And he's like in the car and he's like beating the ceiling. How could you forget? Right. But I think I think she was also, shout out to Hadley, like she was devastated. She was like,
I'm sure.
I mean, she was a devoted, she loved him, right? And she loved his work. She knew its importance, and she was completely devastated that this was somehow her fault, right?
My personal opinion about Hemingway, having spent a lot of time in the biographies, writing a play about him, thinking about all of this, is that he should have stayed with Hadley.
Yes.
And he should have stayed with her so much that I regret him leaving.
I feel the same. And you feel that very intensely when you read A Movable Feast. This is at the end of his life. I think it's the best thing he ever wrote. He wrote it right before he committed suicide, when he thought he couldn't write anymore. I would urge everyone,
he was sort of
Hemingway, start there.
Yeah, it's so good. And get the version of A Movable Feast that was not edited by his fourth wife, Mary.
That's right. That's right.
Get the one that is sort of pure, because of course Mary had a certain degree of bias, being the the final wife.
The
I will
Hemingway
say,
Library just put out a restored version, by the way, just real quick. So
very,
yeah.
And to talk about the footprint that Hemingway has to this day, I know that there's a lot of, we're troubled and, he's so masculine and da-da-da. Again, there's all this gender bending stuff, so who knows what'll end up happening. But when the Bataclan massacre happened, the A Movable Feast sold out in like solidarity with Americans, with the American people who were killed then, and it was like an American heavy metal band that was sort of attacked. That book that book still sells, and that book would be like the literary equivalent of like Dark Side on vinyl. Like it's still selling tens of thousands of copies every year.
As someone that can speak from, I'm sorry, Kevin, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
As someone who can speak to the way that writers go in and out of vogue in the academy, from the belly of the beast, when I was in grad school in the 90s, and I finished in 2003, you couldn't bring Hemingway up without someone starting to denigrate him, right? For points or for whatever. But I have seen my colleagues who teach modernism start teaching Sun Also Rises, Farewell to Arms, and the short stories again. So my sense is that Hemingway, who's never gone out of style, but is back in critical vogue, particularly because of the gender stuff, which is a real thing. And I think, I don't think that you have to do any kind of real fancy stepping to talk about trans stuff and what Hemingway is going. Hemingway's son Gregory died, a transgender woman in
Gloria.
a Miami-Dade, Gloria, right? Dies, a transgender woman in a Miami-Dade jail cell. So, this is a real thing in Hemingway's work. It's a thing in Hemingway's family. So I think that there's, I think a new generation of readers are going to encounter Hemingway and be surprised by how relevant it is.
100%. Put all of that stuff aside. It's extraordinary literature.
That's right.
And extraordinarily influential. So
that's right.
There you go.
100%.
And we're going to touch on all of that. I just want to clarify, at the end of his life, he was reordering and kind of reworking what would become A Movable Feast, but I believe he had written a great deal of it prior. I don't know that he had in any case, he was sort of writing it up until the end of his life, but he wrote it over many years. My understanding of it, Aaron. Yeah. So, cool. Let's keep on keeping on. We're getting it in. This is exciting. So he loses all his juvenilia, all of his early writing. He had been sent on assignment to cover the conference of Lausanne, leaving Hadley, who was sick with a cold, behind in Paris. In Lausanne, he spent days covering a conference and the evenings drinking with Lincoln Steffens. Before setting off to meet him in Switzerland, thinking he would want to show his work to Steffens, Hadley packed all his manuscripts into a valise, which had been subsequently stolen at the train station. Although angry and upset, Hemingway went with Hadley to Montreux to ski, and apparently did not post a reward for the recovery of the valise. An early story, and this is a fun fact, up in Michigan, survived the loss because Gertrude Stein had told him it was unprintable, in part because of a seduction scene, and he had stuffed it into a drawer. He was 23 years old. Hadley's pregnant, and he told Stein, "I'm too young to be a father." With his wife Hadley, Hemingway first visited the Festival of San Fermin in Pamplona, Spain in 1923, where he became fascinated by bullfighting, and not to a small degree. He would write thousands of pages on bullfighting. It's around this time he began to be referred to as Papa, even by much older friends. Hadley would much later recall that Hemingway had his own nicknames for everyone, and that he often did things for his friends. She suggested that he liked to be looked up to. She did not remember precisely how the nickname came into being. However, it certainly stuck. Hadley would stitch clothes while they were sitting in the stands of the bullfights, which is quite a high contrast. You got a bull bleeding to death, and then there's Hadley knitting, probably with Bumby on her knee, possibly little baby boy. In the following September, the couple returned to Toronto. Oh, Bumby hadn't been born yet. Toronto, where their son, John Hadley Nicanor, was born on October 10th of 1923. Nicanor was after a bullfighter Hemingway admired. So it was like that intense. I mean, it'd be
Amazing.
I'm really into the UFC, so I'm going to
I was just thinking, I'm going to name my kid like, right? Anderson Silva, Gwyn.
During their absence from Paris, Hemingway's first book, 3 Stories and 10 Poems, was published. 2 of the stories it contained were all that remained after the loss of the suitcase, and the third had been written early the previous year in Italy. Within months, the second volume, In Our Time, without capitals, was published by Ezra Pound. I believe, Ezra Pound published. The small volume included 6 vignettes and a dozen stories Hemingway had written the previous summer during his visit to Spain, where he discovered the thrill of the bullfight. He missed Paris, considered Toronto boring. I'm sure Toronto's not boring. And wanted to return to the life of a writer rather than the life of a journalist. Hemingway, Hadley, and their son, nicknamed Bumby, which is a nickname I just love. I love the idea of, Bumby.
It's so cute.
So cute. Yeah. Returned to Paris in January of 1924 and moved into a new apartment on the Rue Notre Dame des Champs above a noisy sawmill. Of Paris, Hemingway said, there are few bathtubs, no electric fixtures, and all the charm. I'm going to say this again. There are few bathtubs, no electric fixtures, all the charm, all the good food, and most of the good people in the world. How do you really feel, Hemingway?
No, I'm sorry. You said they moved in above a noisy sawmill?
I believe they did. Yeah, he may have had a studio again.
Okay. That's about the worst environment for a writer possible.
And the squalling baby. He would describe the baby squalling with some horror. His lifelong writing practice was to get up very, very early. He would get up before dawn and he would hammer out his day's work. Later, his sons would sort of say he was very unusual because he was inaccessible until noon, but then an extraordinarily active and available father in person. So he would get a full day's work in before noon. The Hemingways returned to Pamplona in 1924 and a third time in June of 1925. This is the bullfighting. That year, they brought with them a group of American and British expatriates. And now we're coming to The Sun Also Rises. Hemingway's Michigan boyhood friend Bill Smith, Donald Ogden Stewart, Lady Duff Twisden, who was recently divorced, how scandalous, her lover Pat Guthrie, and Harold Loeb. A few days after the fiesta ended, on his birthday, July 21st, he began to write the draft of what would become The Sun Also Rises, finishing 8 weeks later. 8 weeks drafted. A few months later, in December of 1925, the Hemingways left to spend the winter in Schruns, Austria, where Hemingway began revising the manuscript extensively. He edited a lot. I was going to mention this earlier, but when Aaron mentioned A Farewell to Arms, he rewrote the ending of A Farewell to Arms 47 times. Yeah. So I think he's a classic case of he makes it look easy. And yeah. All right. Pauline Pfeiffer, come on down. You're the next contestant on Hemingway's Wives. She joined them in January, and against Hadley's advice, urged Hemingway to sign a contract with Scribner's. He left Austria for a quick trip to New York to meet with the publishers. And on his return, during a stop in Paris, began an affair with Pfeiffer. And Pfeiffer is a beautiful woman from Arkansas, from money, and Catholic. So they start an affair before he returned to Schruns to finish the revisions in March. The manuscript arrived in New York in April. He corrected the final proof in Paris in August of 26, and Scribner's published the novel in October. Hemingway helped Ford Madox Ford edit the Transatlantic Review, which published works by Pound, John Dos Passos, who Hemingway had a friendship with, and I think a falling out eventually. Stein, as well as some of Hemingway's own early work, such as Indian Camp. Indian Camp is a short story about sort of the time in Michigan where I think it might be the Nick Adams character, but the Hemingway stand-in is there with his father. His father's a doctor. The father has to give a C-section to a Native American woman, and I believe the woman dies, and then the husband blows his brains out.
Oof.
And the father and the son have a conversation about suicide and whether many people do it. And there's a moment where I think the boy might even ask, well, do women do it? Do mothers do it too? And the father says, not many of them. And it's just like this very, and this is just like an early short story.
Wow,
it's super intense.
That's heavy. Yeah.
Yeah. When a new edition of In Our Time was published in 1925, the Dust Jacket bore comments from Ford. Indian Camp received considerable praise. Ford saw it as an important early story of a young writer, and critics in the U.S. praised Hemingway for reinvigorating the short story genre with his crisp style and use of declarative sentences. 6 months earlier, Hemingway had met F. Scott Fitzgerald, and the pair formed a friendship of admiration and hostility. That's just like us, Brad.
That's right. You need a little friend. Guys, get a frenemy out there.
That's right. Yeah. Cultivate.
Talented frenemies. It's good.
Yeah.
Good
cultivate relationships you can't quite explain to other people. Fitzgerald had published The Great Gatsby the same year. Hemingway read it, liked it, and decided his next work had to be a novel. So The Sun Also Rises follows directly on Gatsby. Fitzgerald, in fact, is the one who alerted his editor, Max Perkins, at Scribner's about Hemingway. And Fitzgerald, much like Pound to T.S. Eliot, got Hemingway to edit, and I think cut entirely, his first 2 chapters of The Sun Also Rises.
Oh,
Probably
really?
because he was writing his way into the story. Blah, 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 blah. This is the character. Da, da, da. No, cut it. Start here.
Right.
That can work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I have a little something here from the Lynn biography here. Let me find it. Here we go. And this is about Max Perkins. Perkins had received an earlier tip about a young man named Ernest Hemingway, misspelled, in a hurriedly scrawled note that Fitzgerald had sent him the previous October from the villa in the south of France where he was engaged in completing The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald had described Hemingway as an American expatriate who wrote for the Transatlantic Review and was destined to have a brilliant career. Ezra Pound published a collection of his short pieces in Paris at some place like the Egotist Press. I haven't it here now, but it's remarkable, and I'd look him up right away. In a Jamesian phrase, Fitzgerald had added, he's the real thing. After determining that the collection of short pieces was actually a publication of the Three Mountains Press, Perkins ordered a copy from Paris. The package cleared customs in December, but he was too busy to inspect its contents until February, at which point he reported his reaction to Fitzgerald. The book accumulates a fearful effect through a series of brief episodes presented with economy, strength, and vitality, a remarkable, tight, complete expression of the scene in our time, as it looks to Hemingway. Perkins then repeated the substance of this judgment in a letter to the author himself, although he felt constrained to voice the doubt that we could have seen a way to publish to the publication of this book on account of material considerations. It is so small that it would give the booksellers no opportunity for substantial profit if issued at a price which custom would dictate. This is a pity, because your method is obviously one which enables you to express what you have to say in a very small compass. It's sort of like hinting like, hey, maybe write a novel. Mm-hmm. In closing, Perkins emphasized that if Hemingway happened to be writing something that would not raise practical objections to trade publication, Scribner's would like to consider it. Somehow, the letter went astray in the mail, so that Hemingway would have remained oblivious for quite some time if Perkins' interest in his work, if the editor had not written him again a few days later. upon receiving word from John Peel Bishop that the author of In Our Time had indeed been doing some writing that might interest Scribners. Writing back, I cannot tell you how pleased I was by your letter. Hemingway replied to Perkins, you must know how gladly I would have sent Charles Scribner's sons the manuscript. According to the contract he had agreed to sign with Bonnie and Liveright, he explained, they are to have an option on my next 3 books. They agreeing that unless they exercise this option to publish the second book within 60 days of the receipt of the manuscript, their option shall lapse. And if they do not publish the second book, they relinquish their option to the third book. Thus, at the very moment of becoming a Bonnie and Liveright author, Hemingway let Perkins know that he could easily sever his connection with the firm by writing a book that Liveright would be compelled to turn down. If I am ever in a position to send you anything to consider, I shall certainly do so, he told Perkins. He didn't care, though, about writing a novel, he warned the editor, for it seemed to him an awfully artificial and worked form. In any case.
That's an interesting statement about the novel. That's...
Yeah, but I mean, he eventually changed his mind, and it was Fitzgerald who partly, inspired that. It's quite funny because, in any case, we're doing Fitzgerald live in St. Paul, Minnesota, June 5th. Tickets are at my theater company's website, badmouthtc.com. We're going to do a reading of Winter Dreams from Fitzgerald, but that's only going to be after Brad and I do Fitzgerald Part 1. And if you want to see Art of Darkness live, go to that website, badmouthtc.com. It's free. You just got to spend some money at the little German Wurstery and brewery that we're going to be at. It's called Waldman Brewery. Going to be amazing. And
I can't wait.
I'm sure Hemingway will come up at some juncture.
Oh, sure. Yep.
Yeah. Well, so it appears Aaron is, I don't know if Aaron is on mute, but in any case, I'm sure he'll come back. We'll have to see. Is he? Oh, there he is. Aaron, are you still here?
I was just, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was just making sure that I muted my mic so that I could listen to what was going on.
Oh yeah, you're fine. Yeah. Do you have an excerpt from Up in Michigan? Is there anything you care to share about this? You can just chat about it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Actually, I have an excerpt from Indian Camp.
Okay. Okay. Indian Camp. Before you read the excerpt from Indian Camp, just a little bit about Up in Michigan, which is the story that it was only salvaged because it was Stein said you can't publish this, so he stuffed it in a drawer, and it's kind of a dirty story with no boundaries. It's set up in Michigan. Even the title is a bit of a puerile.
This is the thing with Prudy, right? This is him remembering the thing with Prudy, kind of.
Yeah, there's a teenage girl working in a boarding house in Hortons Bay. There's a blacksmith boarder. They go down to the dock, and there's just explicitly like a rape scene. And one of the lines is, she was frightened, but she wanted it. Very difficult, very complicated story. And it got published, and it was, and Hemingway would defend it. He said, look, this is life. This happens. And this gets back to that woke stuff we were talking about earlier, Aaron. Like, do you do anybody a favor if you excise all this stuff out of the canon, if you wipe all these difficult, complex stories and these authors out? I don't think so, personally. We need new stories. Where do you stop? We need new stories. We need new authors. We need to support. Yeah, I'll say diverse authors, diverse experiences, diverse. We need great writing from as many people as possible, and that will naturally be diverse. But there is an awful lot, of the canon that I think people are really quick to try to jettison because they just don't want to deal with it, and they're trying to score points too. So
I agree. I mean, also, I've read that story Up in Michigan fairly recently. It's not a pro-rape story. It deals with a woman's experience, with a savage, brutal man, and the despair of that experience. And I mean, if we can't write about these, what are people writing about?
Right.
I mean, the very first Greek tragedies are about rape.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Hemingway, even there's an anecdote or a bit of a story he tells. I can't recall exactly where he talks about how as a young man up on the boats in, I think maybe in Michigan or somewhere, you'd carry a knife on you because some of the old men would look at you funny.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
really?
you had, oh yeah. And you had to kind of keep, they'd say something like, two eyes are fine, but one eye for me or something like that.
Right,
It was, there was some phrase that was like, yeah, like
right.
there. So Hemingway probably felt a little bit of a, little scare there that, you could transform into this story about this uneasy sexual encounter for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Here's a little bit of Indian camp. At the lake shore, there was another rowboat drawn up. The two Indians stood waiting. Nick and his father got in the stern of the boat, and the Indians shoved it off, and one of them got in to row. Uncle George sat in the stern of the camp rowboat. The young Indian shoved the camp boat off and got in to row Uncle George. The two boats started off in the dark. Nick heard the oarlocks of the other boat quite a way ahead of them in the mist. The Indians rowed with quick, choppy strokes. Nick lay back with his father's arm around him. It was cold on the water. The Indian who was rowing them was working very hard, but the other boat moved further ahead in the mist all the time. "Where are we going, Dad?" Nick asked. "Over to the Indian camp. There is an Indian lady very sick." "Oh," Nick said. Across the bay, they found the other boat beached. Uncle George was smoking a cigar in the dark. The young Indian pulled the boat way up on the beach. Uncle George gave them both Indian cigars. I'm sorry, Uncle George gave both the Indians cigars. They walked up from the beach through a meadow that was soaking wet with dew, following the young Indian who carried a lantern. Then they went into the woods and followed a trail that led to the logging road that ran back into the woods. It was much lighter on the logging road as the timber was cut away on both sides. The young Indian stopped and blew out his lantern, and they all walked along the road.
Yeah. This is early writing.
Oof. Yeah, that's early. Yeah. And bonkers. Again, right? And that the propulsive breath of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's masterful.
It really is. I looked up the phrase, and I am no longer on a Catholic website. I am on.
I just imagined you, Kevin. You have like a browser that only takes you to Catholic.
Yeah, it's a browser extension, right? You see my screen glowing in an unusual way. Send help. No, but this is the importance of being earnest. Hemingway Meets the Gay Gothic by Mark Derry in Thought Catalog. And I found this interesting little passage by looking up that phrase that I was trying to remember. Let's see here. One moment. Right. A Movable Feast is one seriously bitchy book with its feline swipes at Stein, Fitzgerald, and Ford Madox Ford. I had always avoided looking at Ford when I could, and I always held my breath when I was near him in a closed room, Hemingway. And Wyndham Lewis, who in Hem's Unhappy Appraisable had a face of a frog, not a bullfrog, but just any frog, and the eyes of an unsuccessful rapist.
Amazing.
The subject of homosexuality, which Hemingway abhorred in men and was fascinated by in women, is a refrain throughout the book, sometimes openly, but more often through innuendo. There is the famous sex ed lesson Stein gives the square-jawed young man from the Midwest, who concedes all these years later that, well, yes, I had certain prejudices against homosexuality, since I knew its more primitive aspects, summed up in the phrase that wolves used on the lake boats, "Oh, gash may be fine, but one eye for mine."
Wow.
So, yeah. So Hemingway, as a young man, encountered maybe a certain amount of violent or dark pederasty and certain characters that probably turned him off and created like a different time.
There's a certain amount of that in some of the Nick Adams stories where Nick Adams is train hopping, which is something that people used to do quite often. Maybe they still do, as far as I know. And there's a great story called The Battler, where Nick Adams gets thrown off the train by a railroad bull or a railroad cop, and he meets up with these two drifters. One is African American, and the other is like this old boxer that he takes care of. And the old boxer kind of will fly into these rages, and the black character will have to knock him out, right? And he tries. It's amazing. It's an amazing story, right? And so they're all kind of around this fire, the three of them, they're getting ready to have dinner. And then this old boxer gets really aggressive with Nick. And there's the hint of maybe some of what you're talking about, Kevin. And then right when you think, oh my gosh, like something's going to pop off, the black dude just smooth knocks this guy out. And he says, don't worry, son, I wasn't going to let anything happen to you, but it's best if you move along. He gets like this sometimes, and he'll come around and he won't remember any of this. It's, brutal and interesting, but this really sweet moment between this guy who takes care of this old boxer and Nick Adams.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. I'm glad we touched on this, because I remember when I first encountered that, I was like, holy moly.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. This is maybe something you don't think about when you think about Hemingway. Well, so we've set the scene now where Pauline and Hadley have become friends.
Oh, boy.
Hemingway's having an affair with Pauline. He's locked up in a contract. A bigger publisher in the States wants to publish him. So he writes The Torrents of Spring, which is just a straight ahead lampoon of Sherwood Anderson that they would have to reject. We're not publishing this. Hadley hated it. I think Pauline Pfeiffer thought it was brilliant. Right. So now that again, nothing changes. That's a serious problem. If your main boo, if your boo doesn't like your writing, there's probably going to be another boo around the corner who does. If you have any talent at all. I'm just gonna close my door. Hang on.
Yeah. Well, but he wasn't trying to write something good though, right?
No,
that's
right.
Yeah.
No.
But he's Hemingway and he's insecure. And even when you're not doing good writing, if you're Hemingway, the people around you should say that's really good writing, and then you get to say, well, I'm not even trying to write.
Yeah, I phoned this in.
I may be conflating their reaction to The Sun Also Rises, but in any case, it's still amusing. Yeah, it's still amusing.
100%.
It's especially bad if it's The Sun Also Rises. I think. I think it might have been that. Which now that I'm looking at my notes again, it's like, oof. So your wife doesn't like your novel, but your mistress does. Oh,
that's a novel. I like that novel a lot. And Kevin, I think, I know the three of us believe to our core that it's not about what is in vogue. It's not about the social, cultural, political points that any work of art is making. It's about that this is a transcendent work of art. And as Hemingway said, like, if it's any good, it will be just as true in 1,000 years as it is today. Like, that is, for me, that is the thing, right? In terms of the way people see these things, it's interesting that The Sun Also Rises is the Hemingway that English professors and literature professors teach, because it's also one that is undoubtedly anti-Semitic. It's got the N-word all through it, right? So it has all these things that you would think would put, a lot of literature professors off of it, but it's the one they go to.
Yeah, and it's not like it's more like A Farewell to Arms doesn't have really much of that kind of, right? And it's not like Sun Also Rises is that much more accessible than A Farewell to Arms.
I agree. And I like Sun Also Rises a lot as a novel. I think it's very entertaining, but A Farewell to Arms is a better book, ultimately. It's a better work of art.
Agreed. Yeah. Interesting.
IMO, as they say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up to, a big moment here for Hemingway and wife numero dos. And she's already on the scene, right? So let me see here. I'm just getting something open. And I hope you all are having a good time so far. I hope you're enjoying this core episode of Art of Darkness. Brad, where are you at? You feeling good?
Yeah, I mean, I'm learning some things about Hemingway here. This is a figure I knew a bit about, but this is all pretty interesting. I didn't know anything really, I guess, about his childhood. So yeah, I feel like I'm learning a lot. I'm seeing the evolution of a figure here. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think by the end, hopefully it lands the way that I want. I think you'll see what I'm constructing here with this core episode and our good friend of the pod, Aaron Gwyn. All right. So they do Christmas in Austria. The women take turns playing with the baby. They skied, they drank, they played bridge. Ernest takes Pauline on long walks in the snow. She went after him, per Hadley. She wanted him. And she comes from money, talking money, capital M money, in a way that Hadley did not. Hadley had some money, lowercase m money. Now we're like money. The publisher naturally rejects The Torrents of Spring, which is an hilarious title. And so he brought The Sun Also Rises to Scribner's.
Can we mention a thing real quick?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I've never mean to interrupt.
No, not at all, man.
So Hemingway said a famous thing that I've talked about in my classes over the years. He said, not every perfect title has 5 syllables, but a perfect title has 5 syllables. So not every 5-syllable title is perfect, but when you find the perfect title, most of his titles, The Torrents of Spring, right, have 5 syllables.
Okay.
Interesting.
A Farewell to Arms, Men Without Women, For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? It's over and over and over. Of course, The Sun Also Rises is the odd man.
Yeah. I'm happy to report the book I'm working on right now, 5-syllable title.
I'm telling you, dog.
Yeah.
Bestseller, instant bestseller. Now, so I just want to make sure the timeline's right. I don't think he and Pauline are having a physical affair yet, but then he goes to New York. He meets with Max Perkins. He comes back, and instead of going to Hadley, he goes to Pauline in Paris. He doesn't go to Hadley for 3 days, and this is like ultimate betrayal,
dude.
Hadley supported him. Hadley paid his bills a lot of the time.
A good woman. A good woman.
Gave him a child, gave him a son, a beautiful, healthy son. And here he just throws it all away.
She was ride or die.
She was ride or die. Yeah. Well, he came to see Pauline as a mistress. Now, these are North Americans in Paris. And you might be thinking, oh, I'm a sophisticated Parisian and this is my mistress. Good luck. Right. Pauline wouldn't accept it. Right.
She wouldn't accept being his mistress.
She's not a side chick. Pauline is the main character in Pauline's story. And
she was going to tap that ass. She was going to tap that Ernest ass. And, and she was going to be the only one doing it.
That's right. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. So Hadley ends up confronting him. There's a huge scene. If I'd had any sense at all, I'd have let him go with Pauline and burn himself out, Hadley would later say.
Wow.
So she made a proposal. Ernest, take 100 days apart from Pauline, and afterwards, if you still want, I'll give you a divorce. Right? Pauline's family was mortified. Ernest was not a Catholic. A child was involved. Now we're talking about this is what I'm saying, right? I assume somewhere in Hemingway's mind, he's like, well, I'm in Paris, and this is my mistress, and I'm getting a novel published, and this is my wife, and why can't we just do like the locals do, right? And meanwhile, you've got like a family in Arkansas that is just aghast.
Amazing.
Like a Catholic family that's just
A
like,
Catholic
oh,
Southern family, no less.
yes, indeed.
Somebody's
Wow.
loading a shotgun back in,
Yeah.
Fayetteville,
Well,
Arkansas.
there you go. And Vietnam. Yeah, Vietnam. Well, so Ernest starts drinking heavily. He's depressed. 2 months later, November 16th of 1926, Hadley writes him and says she wouldn't stand in the way. So Hadley and Bumby went to the U.S. and Pauline joined him in Paris. And that's the end of that, more or less. Now, Scribner's publishes The Sun Also Rises, and it gets great reviews. The book sold well. Hemingway gave all the royalties to Hadley.
Okay.
And yeah, but
You got to give credit where it's due.
Fair enough, but he's also essentially engaged now to a rich woman. So it's like it's a little bit of a could you do less kind of a thing, right?
Fair enough.
Well, so yeah, and The Sun Also Rises is about a character named Jake Barnes. He's a war veteran with a mysterious wound that has made him impotent. So calling back to those early speculations about his twinning with his sister and his genitalia and of course his own wound. And there's some ambivalence, like, is it a physical wound? Is it a spiritual wound? Is it a combination of them both? He falls in love with a woman named Britt who dresses and lives like a man. She has short hair. And this is sort of all based on, this is very similar to the Bolaño episode where we're talking about the Savage Detectives, very similar, where it's like Hemingway's time running around Europe with these various expats, and he just writes them all in, thinly veiled. He writes in his friend Harold Loeb as this character Cone, who's Jewish and a bit stereotypical and not very flattering. And Harold Loeb was wounded when he read it. He was like, he could not believe it. He was like, he was my friend.
Right.
He thought Hemingway was his friend. And it's like this. So bit of a tricky thing. Well, in any case, The Sun Also Rises epitomized the post-war expatriate generation. It got good reviews. Many recognize it as his greatest work. Some do. Hemingway, the way I think about Hemingway's work is that none of the work, and Gwyn may disagree, none of the work is as good on its own as The Great Gatsby, but the corpus of work is far superior to the body of work of Fitzgerald. That's my assessment of it. None of the novels, I would almost put A Movable Feast next to Gatsby, but it's not really a novel. That's how I personally think about the two men.
I love Hemingway's work a lot. He's been very important to me. I personally believe his short stories are his best work, and I'm a fan of A Farewell to Arms. I like The Sun Also Rises a lot. I like the first half of For Whom the Bell Tolls. I like Old Man and the Sea. Love A Movable Feast. I think the short stories are where I'm not sure America has produced a better short story writer than Hemingway.
Very interesting. I like that take. Very cool. Well, so Hemingway would later write to Max Perkins that the point of the book was not so much about a generation being lost, but that the earth abideth forever. He believed the characters in The Sun Also Rises may have been battered, but were not lost. So Hadley grants him the divorce after accepting the offer of the proceeds from The Sun Also Rises, which is a very romantic gesture, especially after she lost that trunk. So it's not nothing. They were divorced in January of 1927, and Hemingway married Pfeiffer in May. They married in Paris. There were two ceremonies, one at the mayor's office and one at the church. Pauline's family approved of this. I think it didn't hurt that the novel came out. I think there was a quality of like, well, okay, one, it wasn't, the first wedding wasn't a church wedding. It wasn't, they weren't married in the Catholic Church, right? And now, and Ernest is quite successful. And Pfeiffer comes from this family where, I don't know if you all have ever been among the extremely well-heeled. Very often, like they'll pick up an artist into the family as like a prize. It's a thing
Yeah.
that happens.
It's indicative of you being. It's almost like buying culture into your family a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. Not
there's a
that it's
certain
that
quality of-
cynical necessarily, but there is like, well,
Yeah.
we're industrialist types, but we do have this eccentric
yes.
artistic person that we tolerate.
Yeah. Have you heard of our new son-in-law, Ernest Hemingway? He has a novel out. The Times spoke highly of it here at the here at the club, you know. In any case. But of course they're Catholics, so they're not motivated by any cynical anyway. And this is what Ernest would say about that. I've always been a Catholic since I received extreme unction in Italy.
Yeah.
And that is not how the one true faith works. I can say from experience. So, all right. Now a little bit more about Pfeiffer, wife number 2. She had moved to Paris to work for Vogue magazine. Before they were married, he converted. They honeymooned in Le Gras du Roi, where he contracted anthrax. And he planned his... Yeah, there's a little side note. And he planned his next collection of short stories, Men Without Women, which was published in October of 1927. What the hell is anthrax? And how does that happen? Like, what?
I've never heard that.
I thought you died from anthrax. I thought anthrax was one of those ones that just killed you.
This could be a Wikipedia editor just like laughing at us. It's some sort of like a bacterial infection.
Yeah, I get it from certain cow-related situations, I believe.
Well, I mean, it's just treatment is with antibiotics.
Oh, okay.
All right. In any case, so now he's got anthrax. That's cool. Okay, that's pretty metal. All right, so this is the thing about the Hemingway biography and like the Burns documentary. It's like every single scene you could go down, like we're doing on this episode. You can go down 3 different paths and just not stop. You could labor over this for 2 semesters. With in any case, so he's working on Men Without Women. That's published in October of 1927. That includes a boxing story, 50 grand. The editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan, Ray Long, praised that story, calling it one of the best short stories that ever came to my hands. The best prize fight story I ever read, and a remarkable piece of realism. By the end of the year, Pauline is pregnant, and she wants to go back to America. John Dos Passos recommended Key West, and they left Paris in March of 28. Hemingway suffered a severe injury. This is the funniest head injury of all time. I'm calling it. We'll never have a funnier head injury on Art of Darkness. All right? He suffered the injury in their Paris bathroom when he pulled a skylight down on his head, thinking he was pulling a toilet chain.
What?
He thought, and this was like a gash. He had a prominent forehead scar.
You think there might have been a little?
Was he knocking a few back?
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I'm pretty sure. So you have to imagine Hemingway, maybe a little tipsy, climbs upstairs, goes to use the toilet. Big American guy. He's maybe crouched over a little bit, and he pulls this thing, and the skylight cracks him on the head. And he had a scar, and he was reluctant to answer. People would ask him, "How did you get that, Hemingway?"
Well, because he's got all these other like things, right? Like, he got blown up in war, and later on plane crashes and all of that. But what's that one? Oh, well, that's drunkenly pulled the wrong cord.
We don't talk about that.
My buddies who are veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not a veteran. I'm saying my buddies who were veterans, say that getting blown the fuck up is the worst. Like they would rather have been shot and then treated, or catch shrapnel, but to be in that like blast wave and to get shaken like that, they say that's the worst.
You think it's like the pain, or it's the just trauma, like of the trauma word gets thrown around, but we're talking about a traumatic situation. Is it
that's
just like
what it is? It's trauma.
Yeah.
Well,
the chaos and the uncertainty and
the shock wave of the blast, right? I mean, it can, if it hits you right, it can liquefy organs. But what it does to your mind, right? I mean, that's, if you get hit right, it can jelly your brain and liquefy your brain. Of course, if it stops short of that, you get what Hemingway had, is you first traumatic brain injury, you start to get the you've seen MRIs and cross sections of some poor NFL player's brain who has committed suicide, right?
Yeah. It's rough.
Yeah. Well, this is the second big head injury, and we're going to keep track of them the same way we're keeping track of the wives. And yeah, good. Okay, great. So now, after his departure from Paris, he never lived in a big city again, like I said. And now we're getting to another section in my outline that I call the Gulf Stream, that he was obsessed with. He was obsessed with the Caribbean, with the Keys, with the Florida Keys. That whole region is where he lived most of his adult life. So they leave Paris and they go to Kansas City, where their son Patrick was born on June 28th of 1928. She had a difficult delivery, and he fictionalized part of this as part of a farewell to arms. I believe it was a C-section. After Patrick's birth, Pauline and Hemingway traveled to Wyoming, Massachusetts, and New York. In the winter, he was in New York with Bumby, about to board a train to Florida, when he received a cable telling him that his father had killed himself. That year, his father had kind of spiraled into depression and paranoia and a sense of dread. And on that December 6th, Dr. Hemingway, Hemingway's father, he came home at noon, burned some papers, and told his wife he thought he'd lie down. He shot himself with his own father's Civil War revolver. Hemingway called his father a coward. He said he shot himself without necessity. Hemingway would eventually become so well-to-do, he paid his mother a stipend, but he blamed her. I hated my mother as soon as I knew the score. My mother is an all-time, all-American bitch, which I said once before. Mm-hmm. Let's say it again for good measure. I just did, right? Just in case you didn't hear it the first time. Hemingway was devastated, having earlier written to his father telling him not to worry about financial difficulties. The letter arrived minutes after the suicide. He realized how Hadley must have felt after her own father's suicide in 1903, and he commented, "I'll probably go the same way." Oof. He wrote to his friend and publisher, Charles Scribner, in 1949 about his mother. We're stepping out of time here, but I want to touch on this. "I hate her guts and she hates mine. She forced my father to suicide." The fact that Hemingway held his mother responsible for his father's death may be interpreted as a potential source for his deep anger toward his mother, anger so fierce it prompted his friend, John Dos Passos, to refer to the writer as the only man I ever knew who really hated his mother. His friend Charles Lanham also wrote, "He always referred to his mother as that bitch. He must have told me 1,000 times how much he hated her and in how many ways." However, this hatred may have had its origin in Hemingway's early childhood, long before his father's death. His deep and long-standing rage toward his mother may have shaped his conceptualization of his father's suicide so that his father's death became his mother's fault. And then this goes on about the business of the dresses and all the rest. Let's talk a little more about it because I think it's so interesting. Though the Victorian custom of the day did call for young boys to wear dresses, the clothes that Grace selected for Ernest were far more feminine than those worn by other male children of the era. He remained in this style of dress for several years beyond the span most boys spent in dresses, and his hair was cut in a fashion more common for female children. Grace even attempted to pass her son off as the twin of his older sister, despite their differing sizes, which we mentioned. On the back of a photograph of young Ernest wearing a dress decorated in lace, his hair grown long under a hat covered in flowers, Grace wrote the words, "Summer Girl." Grace also praised her son at times for his expression of masculine traits, such as his prowess at hunting and fishing. In any case, so you can sort of see like there's something like really going on here. Grace had a custom of referring to the femininely garbed Ernest as Dutch Dolly. And Ernest called his mother Fweety, like sweetie.
Right.
At the age of 2, in response to his mother's application of the nickname, Ernest told her, "I not a Dutch dolly. Bang! I shoot, Tweety." Woo! Brutal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Devouring mother. That's the devouring mother.
Yes. And we covered that he would point the gun at his father's head. Ernest was powerfully affected by his father's suicide. And in the aftermath, he confided to a friend of his, "My life was more or less shot out from under me, and I was drinking much too much entirely through my own fault." It felt to him as though not only his father's life was shot away, but his own as well. And they call this the Hemingway curse. There is a tradition. I should be sensitive about this. There's a lot of suicide in that family. I don't want to call it a tradition. My understanding is that his father's family unit, out of 8 people, including the 2 parents, 4 of them committed suicide. Both the parents and 6 children. At least 4 killed themselves. Yikes.
Yeah. This is Hemingway's grandfather.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
100%. Brutal. So upon his return to Key West in December of 1928, Hemingway worked on the draft of A Farewell to Arms before leaving for France in January. He had finished it in August, but delayed the revision. Scribner's magazine was set to serialize it in May, but as late as April, Hemingway was still working on the ending. And this says 17 times. I heard 47 times. Anyway, he reworked it over a dozen times. The completed novel was published on the 27th of September that year. His biographer, James Mello, believes A Farewell to Arms established Hemingway's stature as a major American writer and displayed a level of complexity not apparent in The Sun Also Rises. The story was turned into a play by a war veteran, and that was used as the basis of the film starring Gary Cooper. Hemingway on film is very tricky. They haven't made great films of the Hemingway oeuvre for whatever reason. Like the Old Man and the Sea is like embarrassingly bad. Just the Hemingway the adaptations are just terrible. And of course, there's never been a great Hemingway biopic. Hemingway and Gellhorn is embarrassingly bad, despite the talent involved and all the rest of it. It's worth watching if you're like a Hemingway ultra like I am, but it's just like shockingly bad. One day they will do the Hemingway biopic and they will get it right. But in any case, in Spain in mid-1921, Hemingway researched his next work, Death in the Afternoon. He wanted to write a comprehensive treatise on bullfighting, explaining how it worked with a glossary and appendices. He believed bullfighting was of great tragic interest, being literally of life and death. Gwyn already read a little bit of A Farewell to Arms. Brad, you've read A Farewell to Arms, correct?
Yeah, that's one I've actually, beyond just having read it and interested in. I've did some work in graduate school, actually on Farewell to Arms and the 1957 film with Rock Hudson. And
I can't say I can recall it. How is that film? Is it any good?
Not amazing.
Yeah, right.
It's a little short of. It's slightly short of good. Rock Hudson is good in it because he's charismatic and handsome and just fun, interesting to watch. But it's not a great film, and it was sort of hacked to death by production demands before it really met the screen. So what you end up with it's not really Hemingway, and it's not really Ben Heck, the screenwriter. It's not really what he wanted either. It ended up being one of these things that was kind of like, well, I guess we made a movie.
Many such cases.
Yeah, but
some of Hemingway's adaptations were written by Bill Faulkner. We should not.
That's right. One of the short stories, right, was turned into.
I think The Have and Have Not. Maybe.
Oh, that might be what it was. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
It's funny. We've talked about this on the show, and I don't remember it.
I don't either.
I know what it was.
Go back and listen to the core episode that we did with Aaron Gwyn on Faulkner, and then
that was
find
fun.
us. And this is fun too. Yeah,
this is fun too. That was fun. Both are fun. I was thinking about both. those together as companion pieces, since these two guys were in competition with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
100%.
Yeah.
And Hemingway himself, in his own mind, was in competition with Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And at one point, he used the boxing metaphor. I'm in the ring with the best of them, and I'm holding my own, except maybe Tolstoy. Maybe some of my stories kind of stand toe-to-toe with Tolstoy. He loved Tolstoy. Yeah. So, good. And of course, A Farewell to Arms is a fabulous novel of World War One and an amalgamation.
It's that's the part I got distracted talking about the movie. Farewell to Arms is like a must read, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
Here's a sentence from it, or a para, rather. If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them. So, of course, it kills them. The world breaks everyone, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. All right. During the early 1930s, Hemingway spent his winters in Key West and summers in Wyoming, where he found the most beautiful country he had seen in the American West and hunted deer, elk, and grizzly bear. He was joined there by John Dos Passos, and in November of 1930, after bringing Dos Passos to the train station in Billings, Montana, Hemingway broke his arm in a car accident. The surgeon tended the compound spiral fracture and bound the bone with kangaroo tendon. Hemingway was hospitalized for 7 weeks, with Pauline tending to him. The nerves in his writing hand took as long as a year to heal, during which time he suffered intense pain. He and Pauline traveled to Kansas City, where their son Patrick was born. I think we already had that happen. Difficult delivery. That comes out in A Farewell to Arms. So now we have them traveling. He finds this news that his father has killed himself, and he does all this business where he's getting that novel published, and that cements his stature as a major American writer. I mean, that book, when that came out, that was a huge deal. Now, he was at that time, and of course he was also in a rivalry with Fitzgerald, right? So he's kind of having a bit of a rivalry with Fitz, and I want to pause and talk about the time. Are either of you familiar with the round, the famous round? The dick
measuring contest? The literal dick measuring contest?
No, tell me about that while I find the part about where, Fitzgerald was the timekeeper for a round that Hemingway was in of boxing. Anyway, go on. Tell us about the dick measure.
Well, So Hemingway in A Movable Feast says that Fitzgerald showed up completely distraught, and Hemingway had to kind of milk, what is it, and just kind of keep at him. And Fitzgerald said, just, Zelda says I have a small dick, basically. Right? And Hemingway says, well, women often say that when they want to upset their guy. I mean, it doesn't mean anything, it's kind of a cruel thing to say, but I'm sure it's fine. And Fitzgerald's like, I don't know, she's got me convinced that the dick is pretty small. And Hemingway goes, here, come on. So they go into the bathroom, and Hemingway's like, show it to me. And so Fitzgerald pulls out his dick, and Hemingway's like, that's a totally, I'm paraphrasing, but, it's a totally nice dick. You shouldn't be upset about that dick.
It's got the vein and everything. It's great.
It's good. It's a good dick.
It's a perfectly good Minnesota dick.
It's a good Minnesota dick, man.
If I had a nickel every time I heard that.
Yeah. But I mean, he's like, you're fine. You're not small in the kind of average, and you're totally average. You're totally normal. And your lady's just fucking with you. Don't let her do that to you.
Yeah, your textbook BPD art hoe wife is.
She might be messing with your head a little bit.
She might be messing with your head.
Amazing,
old Fitzy. Fun. Good. I don't know how I had never heard that story, but I love it.